He was older than her. He was powerful and respected.
He bought her lavish gifts. He spoiled her. He really made her feel special.
But wanting to hold on tight to this new life can sometimes cause you to do the unthinkable.
There are bloodstains all over the driver's side of the vehicle.
It's starting to look like this was possibly a setup.
It was one of my worst fears. It was almost like a nightmare coming true.
When love comes along and fills that dark void, some will do anything to keep it.
I want to be loved so bad. The child wants love so bad.
He says jump, she says how high.
It's crazy the things that people would do for love.
March 30th, 2012, New Orleans, Louisiana. Known for its infamous Bourbon Street and Mardi Gras, the Big Easy is like no other city in the world.
When people think of New Orleans, they think of parties, the good times, the festivals, Jazz Fest, Essence Fest, Mardi Gras.
But just before dawn on a warm spring Friday morning, New Orleans Police Dispatch receives a 911 call.
It was about 5 a.m. A caller said that there was a car stopped in the middle of the street and it was still running, and the driver appears to be slumped over in the front seat.
They were just concerned, didn't know if the person might have had a medical event or might be intoxicated in some way.
This is New Orleans. There's a lot of drinking that happens here, and it's not uncommon to get a call of someone passed out in a vehicle.
The nearest officer responds to the address in New Orleans East, known as a high crime area.
When police arrive, there's nobody else around, and they see the car running, the brake lights on, and the officer walks up and knocks on the window, and the person inside doesn't respond, doesn't move.
The officer opens the door and sees a man in the driver's seat with his foot still on the brake and the car still in drive, but the man is not responding.
The officer can't find a pulse on him.
The officer looks around the car and notices blood splatter, and then he looks closer at the man, and he saw what looked like a gunshot wound to the back of the head.
At that time, the officer contacts the homicide detectives to come out.
Detectives and CSI quickly arrive. They examine the body first.
The body was of a Hispanic male, maybe in his 30s or 40s, and he was covered in tattoos. He was wearing a black shirt and blue jeans.
They notice multiple bullet wounds in the back of this man's head.
The detectives notice that his pockets were flipped out, and he doesn't have a wallet, which is usually a sign that he was robbed.
Yet there are no signs of a struggle.
He was clearly taken by surprise and executed.
They start looking for any type of physical evidence. They look inside the vehicle where they locate shell casings.
Detectives collect two .40 caliber spent casings from the rear driver's side seat and one spent casing in the right front passenger seat. They also find a spent pellet lodged in the front ceiling of the car.
There are bloodstains all over the driver's side of the vehicle.
Based on the blood splatter, the position of the wounds, and the location of the shell casings, detectives theorize that the shooter was likely sitting in the back seat.
It suggests that whoever the killer was, it was someone that the victim either known or he allowed to get in his personal space.
Was this just a random robbery or something far more calculated?
Investigators also theorize that the male must have been slowing down or come to a stop when the shooting occurred, since his foot was still on the brake.
Unfortunately, they have no idea who the victim is, although they do find something interesting in the back seat.
They find a bag in the back seat. They go through that. They can't find any sort of identifying information.
It did have a bunch of tattoo supplies, tattoo guns, tattoo needles, things of that sort. And he's covered in tattoos, so this could possibly help police identify him.
After investigators' initial survey of the vehicle, a crime scene technician collects the evidence.
They collect blood samples from various spots throughout the front seat. They are looking for any sort of fingerprints they can collect, any sort of fibers. They actually take DNA samples from the inside-out pockets on the victim, just in case they might get some touch DNA.
Meanwhile, others on the force begin knocking on doors and looking for security cameras.
This is a desolate area. There were a lot of abandoned buildings and not very many people around. And the few people that they did find didn't see anything, didn't hear anything, and there were no cameras in the area.
The detectives don't have much to go on. They don't know who the victim is, they don't know why he was at this location, and they don't know who he was with.
All police have is the car.
Investigators run the plates on the vehicle, and it comes back registered to a woman named Tiffany Morris.
Detectives obtain her address, and around 8 a.m., they head to her home.
Police explain to Tiffany why they're there. They're investigating a homicide. They ask her if she owns a silver sedan. She says yes. And they give her a description of the man that was in the driver's seat. That's when Tiffany breaks into tears, saying that that is her boyfriend, Jose Preciado.
Born in November 1973, Jose Preciado was raised with limited means in a small Texas town.
Jose grew up poor and without a dad, so his family struggled.
Yet from an early age, Jose discovered he had great talent.
He could freehand draw anything. He was super fast at it. And he just was an awesome artist as far as drawing.
Jose's artistic passion soon led him to the world of tattooing.
He started off with the homemade tattoo gun, which would be the sewing needle with the ink pen and the motor, and you give him a picture, he could draw it on you with an ink pen and do it. And then over the years, he's gotten better, and he got a real tattoo gun and started doing them like that.
He would travel around, and people would call and ask for one. And he would come and do it at your home, so it was a lot of word of mouth.
With his outgoing personality, Jose quickly made a career out of it.
He was the type of person who made friends very easily. He was the life of the party.
He even gave himself a nickname.
Everybody on the streets knew him as S.A., not Jose. And he had S.A. tattooed across his stomach in big old English letters. Everyone knew him as S.A.
Eventually, S.A. decided to leave his hometown for bigger and better opportunities.
He came to New Orleans because it was a big city and started over. He loved it. He loved the people, and it was more easier for him to network.
His tattooing career really takes off. He just has people lining up, calling him left and right to get tattoos.
It would just take one person to get a tattoo, and then the whole neighborhood is getting a tattoo. He would come to your house to do tattoos, and that's how I met him.
S.A. met Tiffany Edmonston in 2002.
I wanted a tattoo, and it was pretty much all he wrote. Love at first sight. He was my first love. He was sweet. He was kind. He was different than the guys that I was normally around. I love that he put me first.
S.A. and Tiffany quickly became inseparable. Eventually, they started a family.
They actually told us the whole time that he was going to be a little girl. 9 months later, a little boy came out, and we was ecstatic. And then 3 years later, we had our daughter.
He loved being a father. A family is something that S.A. always wanted, since he didn't really have a strong family growing up. So he was just really excited to have a family of his own.
He wanted his kids to have a better life than what he did. He wanted to be present in it. He wanted to provide everything that he didn't get to do as a child. He wanted them to do.
S.A. channeled his devotion to his family into his tattoo business. Unfortunately, that meant a lot of time away from home in some unsavory places, which eventually caused him and Tiffany to end things.
He's going out at all hours of the night, meeting strangers all the time. You know, you don't know who you're meeting out there.
I started to not agreeing with the tattoos. Now, we have 2 kids. You need to be safe. I would worry about is him going out there to leave to go do a tattoo and never coming back.
Now, homicide detectives are at his new girlfriend's door, telling her S.A. has been murdered.
It was one of my worst fears. It's like what I was scared that would happen. It was almost like a nightmare coming true.
She agrees to come down to the station and help investigators any way she can. That's when they get their first big lead.
Received a phone call. It was around 3:30.
Do you know who this person was?
On March 30th, 2012, New Orleans detectives are investigating the murder of 38-year-old father and local tattoo artist, Jose S.A. Preciado, found dead behind the wheel of his girlfriend's car.
It looked like he had fallen victim to a violent robbery. He was found in his vehicle with his pockets flipped out and no wallet and no money.
Detectives have just informed his girlfriend, Tiffany, and she agreed to speak with him.
All right. Someone you know in relation to this murder, Jose's murder.
I mean, we came home around 2:30.
He had been visiting with a friend of his named Carl.
Do you know what he was wearing when he came home?
You know, it was a black tee and his house slippers.
He went by Carl's house. He stayed there for maybe 15 minutes. He came back home.
He received a phone call. It was around 3:30. I answered the phone. It was a female, and I gave him the phone. The person on the other end said they wanted a full tattoo done on their back.
Do you know who this person was?
No.
Did he mention who this person was?
No.
It definitely wasn't uncommon for someone to call and say they want to get a tattoo at 3 o'clock in the morning. Being in New Orleans, being the type of party city it is, it was kind of normal. He would jump up and he would go chase this dollar, you know, which it was his only income, so he wasn't going to pass up making any money.
When he got off the phone, he told me he was going in the east on Sydney Place to do a tattoo, a full back tattoo.
Usually when he goes to do tattoos, he always brings someone with him just for his own safety. But in this incident, he went alone.
So what time did he left? About 3:30?
About 3:30, between 3:30 and 3:45.
Okay. When he borrowed your car?
Right.
Did he call you or text you when he got to New Orleans East? That you know they made it?
It was a little bit after 4, and I texted him, did you make it? And he responded, just made it. That's the last text.
She says S.A. took his bag with him that has his tattoo equipment and some cash.
He always had a knot of money on him. He always handled it was only cash.
S.A. had about $300 to maybe $400 of cash in his pocket.
His girlfriend says when she woke up and he wasn't there, she got worried.
And when I called his phone, he was going straight to voicemail.
Before she could do anything, detectives were at her door.
Hearing that he had received a phone call that led him to New Orleans East, which was obviously where he was robbed and killed for his cash, detectives immediately want to find out who the other person was on the phone. And they had a feeling that it might be someone that S.A. knew and that they knew that he would have cash on him.
It's starting to look like this was possibly a setup.
Who do you think might have murdered your man?
I don't know. I don't know nobody from these. I don't know what happened.
Do you have any idea who was angry with him for anything?
No.
She provides detectives with the phone numbers of the woman who called S.A. at 3 a.m., along with S.A.'s friend, Carl, who he had visited earlier.
Police run a search on a phone number tied to a mysterious woman who had called about a tattoo.
While they wait for the results, detectives visit S.A.'s friend, Carl.
They go and speak to Carl, and Carl says that, yeah, S.A. came over at about 2:15 that morning, and they just chit-chatted. Nothing serious. He didn't know anything about this tattoo appointment.
The last thing he knows is that S.A. went home. Other than that, he had no further information about any caller or anything like that.
But when the detectives asked him if he knew anyone who might have a beef with S.A., Carl admitted he might know something.
Carl tells detectives that he heard on the street that S.A. was being accused of being an informant.
In fact, he says he heard there was one guy who was particularly upset about it, a well-known drug dealer who goes by Naughty.
Carl informs them that supposedly Naughty had received information that S.A. was talking to the police and being a confidential informant. In the streets, that's definitely a reason for someone to want to kill you.
2 hours after accusing S.A. of being an informant, this guy has his door knocked in and police are raiding his house. That event just added fuel to the fire.
At this point, Carl doesn't know if Naughty is actually involved. This is something that he's been hearing in the streets.
Carl said several other people accused him of being an informant as well, but Naughty was the last one.
Investigators are now riddled with multiple questions.
Did Naughty kill S.A.? Did he hire someone to kill S.A.? Or could it have been someone else altogether different?
How does this woman who called S.A. fit into it all?
Did she call to lure him out there? Is she the killer?
As a detective, when you get a phone number and you want to do a search warrant for it, you have to find out who that carrier is and call every phone company and find out if that's their phone number and if they are the carrier for that phone number. And that's a real tedious process. Right now, the clock is ticking. He wants to try to find out who this person is because they know what they did and they could be trying to get rid of the phone or trying to run away.
While investigating the murder of Jose S.A. Preciado on March 30th, 2012, homicide detectives with the New Orleans Police Department have just uncovered a critical piece of the puzzle.
They learned from his friend Carl that S.A. had been accused of being a police informant by a local narcotics dealer named Naughty, who then had his house raided.
Investigators reach out to the New Orleans East Narcotics Division to follow up on Carl's tip, and they confirm the raid.
They did raid this person's house, and the narcotics unit also says that they arrested him and that he is awaiting trial on drug charges.
When they speak with the detectives there, they learn that there actually was an investigation with a subject by the nickname of Naughty, and the real name of Naughty, which was Renard Coleman.
They also tell detectives that they have no record of Jose S.A. Preciado.
The narcotics division had never even heard of S.A. Naughty just got it in his head that S.A. was an informant.
Detectives hope the phone records will give them a lead.
In May, they finally get the results back from the cell phone company. Unfortunately, it was a dead end.
The phone that actually called S.A., it was a burner phone. There was no information about the owner of that phone.
With nothing solid against Naughty, investigators continue to look for other leads.
The detectives go back to the scene, they knock on doors, but unfortunately, no one gives up anything.
It's not until early July when detectives get a tip. the one they'd been hoping for.
A woman named Sophia reaches out to police and says that she has information about S.A.'s death.
All right. What do you know about that murder?
She says that she knows a family member that is deeply involved.
Shawayne.
Shawayne.
Shawayne's mom.
Okay.
Born December 10th, 1994, and raised in New Orleans East, Shawayne Sanders had a rough start to life.
New Orleans East in the 90s and 2000s had really just fallen on hard times. There was a lot of violent crime, a lot of drug dealing, and this is the type of environment that she grew up in. She was surrounded by it.
Her neighborhood was plagued by crime, so her family was not immune to the pitfalls of their surroundings.
She didn't really have a lot growing up. She came from a family of meager means.
In 2005, Shawayne's circumstances went from bad to worse.
Hurricane Katrina hit this already struggling neighborhood and just absolutely decimated it. This was a very traumatic experience for her and her family, losing absolutely everything, having to start from scratch and rebuild.
Shawayne grew to develop a survival mindset. She was always on alert, constantly adapting to keep herself safe.
She tried hard in school and wanted to get out of her situation, but sadly, Shawayne ended up dropping out at 15.
She couldn't read and she could barely write. She never got a driver's license, so she fell into the wrong crowd just to survive.
It's in this group that she meets Renard Coleman, who goes by the nickname Naughty.
While there was an age gap, they just had an instant connection.
She just really liked his street savviness and his toughness and the way that everyone else kind of feared and respected him. She always felt protected by him. She really feels empowered in this position.
Renard gave Shawayne much more than just protection. He gave her a life of luxury.
He bought her lavish gifts. He spoiled her. He really made her feel special. Coming from the background that she did, she was used to having to just scrape by and not really have any of the nicer things in life. She really felt like she was somebody with Renard.
He provided a sense of stability that she hadn't had before.
She was willing to do anything for him.
Now, on July 3rd, 2012, detectives are speaking with Sophia, who says Shawayne was involved in the murder of Jose S.A. Preciado.
Sophia informs the detectives that Shawayne actually admitted that she's the one that called S.A. on the phone to set up the tattoo appointment. She also informed them that she was involved with the homicide to help her boyfriend, Naughty, out.
According to Sophia, it was just supposed to be a robbery.
He told Shawayne to go rob this guy. Later on, we found out that he said that the guy was an informant.
Okay. Now, how do you know all of this?
Because she told me.
Who told you?
Shawayne.
When this happened, do you know what Naughty's instructions exactly were and to who?
That's when Sophia reveals everything she knows about the night S.A. was murdered in cold blood and who was responsible.
She panicked and Shawayne grabbed a gun from him.
February 2013. Almost a year after Jose Preciado's murder, an anonymous tip has led detectives to a possible eyewitness, Priscilla.
Detectives show her a photo of Shawayne, and she admits that she knows her. In fact, they used to live together and date back in March of 2012.
Priscilla says she and Shawayne were in a relationship at the same time that Shawayne was in a relationship with Naughty.
Priscilla tells police that she was fine with the arrangement, and so was Shawayne. But Renard wasn't.
He really didn't want them to be together. He tried to keep Shawayne from seeing Priscilla, and he was just really jealous.
Priscilla really just tells police kind of what they've already been hearing about how obsessed she was with him. You know, he says jump, she says how high.
Priscilla admits that Naughty was convinced S.A. was going to testify against him at his drug trial, which could lead him to doing serious time. So he wanted him gone fast.
A few days before the murder actually happened, Priscilla says that he actually asked her if she would shoot S.A. for him, and she flat out refused.
She didn't want anything to do with it. At that time, Naughty pulled out a gun and actually pointed it to her head and threatened her to do it.
She said it was a black handgun, and he ended up letting her go, and she just left that situation alone because she was scared.
Priscilla says Naughty must have turned to Shawayne for help because she saw it happen.
Priscilla informs the detectives that on the day of the homicide, she was at a residence with Sanders.
Priscilla says that S.A. was at their house and she just assumed that they had invited him over. At one point, she decides she wants a cigarette, so she leaves the house. She goes out for a walk.
Not too long after she left the house, Priscilla sees S.A.'s silver sedan coming down the road. She sees Shawayne and a young man named Trey, also known as Smalls, in the car with S.A.
She sees S.A. in the driver's seat, and Trey is in the passenger seat, and Shawayne's in the back seat behind the driver. She also sees Naughty in his truck following a bit behind the silver sedan.
She observes the victim's vehicle slowly kind of driving in the area, and she observed the brake lights illuminate. At that point, she observed Smalls exit the passenger side of the vehicle and Sanders exit the rear driver's side of the vehicle.
Priscilla tells investigators that Smalls ran down the road and got into Naughty's vehicle, and Shawayne took off on foot.
She observed that she was holding a gun.
Priscilla said that she recognized the gun as the same gun that Naughty had put in her face a few days before.
She stated she did not hear any gunshots. She couldn't hear what was being said. She honestly didn't know what occurred.
She says the scene struck her as a little strange with the car sitting there with its brake lights on. But as she continued on her walk, she figured he'd drive off eventually.
Priscilla says that in the following days, she was hearing more and more chatter on the streets about the fact that S.A. was found dead.
Priscilla says that once she connected the dots, she was faced with a dilemma.
She stated that she loved Sanders and didn't want to see her going to jail or getting hurt at any point, but she didn't want to come forward to police in fear for her own life.
Priscilla's eyewitness account matches the evidence that the police have, and it's enough for police to get an arrest warrant for Shawayne Sanders.
They have a witness who actually puts the gun in Sanders' hand. We know the victim was shot in the back of the head, and this witness actually saw Sanders exit the rear driver's side of the vehicle, the location where the shooter had to be seated when they shot S.A.
Detectives get a warrant for Shawayne's arrest. And then, on February 27, 2013, they locate her at her grandmother's house.
Immediately when she come down, they place her in handcuffs. She's now under arrest for second-degree murder.
It made sense that it was a female that pulled the trigger because you don't allow a man to sit behind your head. Like, that's like the street code. And then how young she was, and just, it was a lot. It was a lot to take in, a lot to sort through. I just couldn't understand.
At the police station, Shawayne refuses to give a statement and immediately asks for a lawyer.
They collect her fingerprints and her DNA, hoping something might match samples found at the crime scene.
Investigators still have some loose ends to tie up. They find the other witness, 16-year-old Trey, also known as Smalls.
Detectives speak to him with his mother, and he's pretty tight-lipped. So at that point, there's not much that they can do.
Smalls was just the wrong place, the wrong time
Because he was a minor and he appeared to have a minimal role in the crime, charges were eventually dropped against Trey.
Police focus on the man behind the murder, Renard Naughty Coleman.
Naughty was just as culpable as Sanders because he's the person who orchestrated the hit. He actually made a statement to a witness and then asked him to do a killing for him. So he was just as responsible.
If detectives can't find him, there's a good chance he might get away with murder. Sometimes older men, powerful men, will prey on younger women because they know that that's how they can control them. And in the end, they're able to get their loyalty and get them to do anything they want for them.
February 2013, New Orleans, Louisiana. 18-year-old Shawayne Sanders has been charged with second-degree murder for killing 39-year-old Jose S.A. Preciado.
Police are still looking for the man they believe put her up to this, her boyfriend, Naughty.
As prosecutors prepare for trial, they get the results of the tests conducted on Shawayne's DNA. But it's not what they were hoping.
Her DNA was not in the victim's pants pocket, nor in the car anywhere. Her fingerprints were not in the vehicle, but the prosecutors moved forward with the case anyway.
They still have Sophia and James, and they'll have to rely heavily on their testimonies.
Sanders confessed to both of them, and they have Priscilla's testimony that she was there and saw her getting out of the car with a gun in her hand.
Finally, in June 2013, detectives find the elusive Naughty and bring him in.
But they get him in, and he's not talking.
He's also charged with second-degree murder. He and his girl are possibly looking at life sentences.
Prosecutors offer a plea deal to both of them, but they both declined, willing to take their chances in front of a jury.
Prosecutors decide to separate their trials. Shawayne is first. On March 17, 2015, prosecutors are ready to take her on in court. However, Shawayne, now 20 years old, does something no one sees coming.
The morning of the trial gets here, and she surprises everybody by pleading last minute.
She agrees to plead guilty to manslaughter and receives 35 years in prison with time served.
Shawayne will be up for parole in 2048. Not much later, her boyfriend follows suit.
Naughty also takes a plea instead of risking a life sentence at trial.
He is sentenced to 20 years with time served.
That just blows my mind. How can you take someone's life and then still have a chance to live life afterwards?
Although some say justice was done, Jose's family is now left with a huge hole in their lives.
He was a good guy, someone that would do anything for anybody, someone who just wanted to make people laugh. I don't know what the world's missing, but I know what my kids are missing. My kids are missing their dad.
Neither Shawayne nor Renard ever confessed, but for those involved in the case, one theory remains hard to ignore.
She did this for her boyfriend. He was the mastermind behind all of this.
She was in love with Naughty. She would do anything for him. She did not want to see him going to jail for years.
Naughty provided for her, and she didn't want to let anything happen that might risk having all of that taken away.
I couldn't wrap my head around it. Because I wouldn't have done anything. At least I thought I would have done anything for S.A. But I know me as the person I am, I would have never took someone else's life.
She thought this was a way to save him and save their relationship. So she decided to kill for her man.
The allure of an older man showering you with gifts is hard to ignore. But not everything that glitters is gold. And it can sometimes cost you your freedom.
What if the man who swore an oath to protect you from the monsters lurking in the dark was the monster himself? What if the terrifying footsteps echoing down a deserted, rain-slicked alleyway at 2 a.m. belonged not to a shadowy phantom or an escaped convict, but to a decorated, gun-toting city police officer wearing a polished silver badge and a crisp navy uniform? That is the nightmare that took root in the shivering, frost-bitten heart of Boston in the dark, early morning hours of November 12, 1992, a nightmare that bled across 34 agonizing years, paralyzing an entire metropolitan community, baffling generations of seasoned homicide detectives, and leaving behind a cold, suffocating trail of shattered lives, unanswered questions, and institutional corruption that went all the way to the top. The year 1992 was a violent, turbulent era for the city of Boston. The crack epidemic was tearing through working-class neighborhoods. Gang rivalries were claiming young lives on street corners from Roxbury to Mattapan, and the Boston Police Department was fighting a brutal, low-intensity war to maintain order across the city's rougher sectors. But in the historic cobblestone enclave of Beacon Hill and the nearby bustling commercial district of Downtown Crossing, a completely different kind of predator was silently hunting. This wasn't a reckless street gangster or an erratic junkie looking for quick cash. This was a ghost, a cold, calculating, hyper-disciplined predator who moved through the city's shadows with absolute authority, knowing every police shift change, every blind spot in security coverage, every dark alleyway, and precisely how to ensure that no witness would ever speak and no evidence would ever survive. At 6:45 a.m. on November 12, 1992, the biting Atlantic wind blew heavy fog off Massachusetts Bay, cloaking the narrow, red brick alleys of Beacon Hill in a damp, freezing mist. A sanitation crew turning the corner onto Mount Vernon Street made a discovery that would instantly stop the heart of the city. Lying in a secluded, brick-walled courtyard behind an elegant brownstone townhouse was 22-year-old Claire Vance, a brilliant, fiercely independent senior at Boston University studying international relations, who also worked late shifts as a paralegal at a prestigious law firm in downtown Boston. Claire was supposed to have arrived home 4 hours earlier. Her roommates had expected her around 2:30 a.m. after she left a late-night study group and boarded a Green Line trolley. She never made it to her front door. She lay on the frozen brick pavement, her coat neatly arranged beside her, her wrists bearing distinct, painful red indentations suggesting she had been restrained with heavy, high-grade steel restraints. Her purse was completely untouched, her money and credit card still inside, ruling out a simple robbery in an instant. Her cause of death was brutally straightforward, a single, contact-distance execution bullet to the base of the skull, fired from a medium-caliber handgun. The crime scene was unnervingly, terrifyingly clean. There were no spent brass shell casings left on the cobblestones. There were no foreign footprints in the damp leaf litter. There were no signs of a frantic, violent struggle. It was as if the killer had materialized out of the heavy autumn fog, executed a defenseless 22-year-old woman with military precision, meticulously collected every single trace of physical evidence, and vanished back into the night without triggering a single dog bark, a single security light, or a single scream. By 8 a.m., the quiet, residential street was swarming with flashing red and blue lights, marked cruisers, yellow crime scene tape, and dozens of high-ranking police officials. The headlines printed in afternoon editions of the Boston Globe and the Boston Herald sent shockwaves of sheer panic through every home, college dorm, and business in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Execution in Beacon Hill, Boston University student murdered in brick alleyway, police hunt for phantom killer in historic district. The pressure on the Boston Police Department's homicide unit was instantaneous and crushing. The victim was young, articulate, deeply loved, and connected to influential legal circles in the city. Her father was a retired state judge. Her mother was a prominent pediatrician. The mayor held an emergency press briefing on the steps of City Hall, promising that no stone would be left unturned, that every available detective would be assigned to the case, and that the monster responsible would be brought to justice swiftly. Lead homicide detective Frank Callahan, a tough, tobacco-chewing 30-year veteran of the department who had investigated hundreds of street homicides, stood in the freezing cold courtyard, staring down at the pristine brickwork where Claire's body had been found. Something about the scene made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. It was too clean. It was too professional. It lacked the sloppy, chaotic, desperate markers of an amateur criminal. Whoever did this didn't just get lucky with the weather, Callahan whispered to his partner, Detective Ray Miller, as crime scene technicians dusted the surrounding wrought iron gates for latent prints. He knew where to take her. He knew where the street lights were burned out. He knew how to hold a weapon so the brass didn't bounce onto the street. He didn't panic. He took his time. He executed her like he was following a checklist. As the initial hours turned into days, detectives launched a massive, sweeping canvass of Beacon Hill, Downtown Crossing, and the Boston University campus. They interviewed over 300 potential witnesses, tracked down every taxi driver who was on duty between midnight and 4 a.m., audited public transit logs, and checked local pawn shops for missing personal items. But every single lead ended in a hollow, frustrating dead end. There was only one tantalizing, deeply bizarre detail that emerged from the initial canvass. A night shift security guard stationed at an office building 3 blocks away from the crime scene reported seeing a marked Boston police cruiser idling in a dark alley near Mount Vernon Street at approximately 2:15 a.m. The guard paid it no attention at the time, assuming it was a routine sector patrol checking doors. But when detectives attempted to cross-reference the cruiser's presence against official police logbooks, shift rosters, and dispatch records for Sector A1, they hit a strange, impenetrable wall. According to official department dispatch records, no marked unit had been dispatched to that specific block of Beacon Hill at 2:15 a.m. on November 12th. Sector logs indicated that the 2 primary patrol units assigned to that neighborhood were miles away, one handling a domestic disturbance in the West End, and the other taking a meal break at a diner near South Station. When Detective Callahan tried to push deeper into the patrol logs, asking to inspect the individual vehicle mileage logs and key checkout sheets for Sector A1's night shift, his request was suddenly met with unusual administrative resistance from high-ranking department brass. He was told the records were misfiled during a shift change, or lost in an office relocation, or simply unavailable. Part 2. The chilling possibility that a predator was operating from behind a polished silver badge in the autumn of 1992 sent shockwaves of quiet dread through the inner corridors of the Boston Police Department's homicide unit. Detective Frank Callahan and his partner Ray Miller found themselves treading on dangerous, unstable ground. Investigating a murder in a major American city was difficult under the best circumstances. Investigating a murder where the primary suspect might be wearing the exact same Navy uniform, carrying the exact same department-issued sidearm, and sitting at the desk right next to you was an absolute nightmare. In the days immediately following Claire Vance's murder, the atmosphere inside the Sector A1 station house turned suffocatingly tense. The initial outrage that typically rallied officers together after a violent crime in their district was replaced by a strange, guarded paranoia. Glances exchanged across the squad room felt longer, heavier, laden with unspoken suspicion. Every patrol officer who had worked the 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. dogwatch shift on the night of November 11th was quietly scrutinized, but without concrete physical evidence or a clear eyewitness identification. Making a direct accusation against a sworn colleague was professional suicide. Detective Callahan focused his attention on reconstructing Claire Vance's final known movements with surgical precision. On the night she died, Claire had left the Boston University Student Union building around 1:45 a.m. Rain was falling in heavy, wind-whipped sheets as she walked toward the MBTA Green Line station on Commonwealth Avenue. Witnesses remembered seeing her standing under the brightly lit glass shelter of the trolley stop, wrapped in her dark wool coat, holding her umbrella against the gale-force Atlantic wind. A student who knew Claire testified that he saw her boarding a streetcar, but transit logs indicated that service on that particular branch was experiencing severe delays due to localized track flooding near Kenmore Square. Passengers were forced to disembark and make their way on foot or flag down cabs along Boylston and Arlington streets. This was where the clear, verifiable timeline collapsed into a dark, impenetrable void. Claire was smart, cautious, and hyper-aware of her surroundings, Callahan noted in his handwritten case notes, staring at a giant aerial map of downtown Boston pinned to the squad room wall. She grew up in this city. She knew the dangers of walking alone through downtown crossing after 2 a.m. She wouldn't have accepted a ride from a stranger. She wouldn't have gotten into an unmarked car. She wouldn't have let anyone approach her in a dark alleyway unless that person carried an undeniable, unquestioned aura of safety and legal authority. That authority came in the form of a uniform. In 1992, if a marked police cruiser pulled up alongside a young woman walking home in a torrential downpour, flashed its overhead cruisers or tapped its siren, and an officer stepped out offering a safe escort home, any law-abiding citizen would have complied without a second thought. She would have stepped into the passenger seat believing she was being protected, completely unaware that she was stepping into a rolling trap. As November bled into a freezing, gray December, the investigation began to stall under the weight of dead-end tips, false leads, and political pressure. The local media was relentless. Television news crews camped outside the station house every morning, demanding updates, while women's safety advocacy groups held candlelight vigils on the steps of City Hall, shouting slogans that demanded immediate action from the mayor and the commissioner. Behind closed doors, Callahan's attempts to secure the internal mechanical logs and mileage reports for all Sector A, one cruisers assigned to the night of November 11th, continued to hit baffling bureaucratic roadblocks. Forms were lost, supervisors gave evasive answers, and Callahan was repeatedly reminded by high-ranking commanders to focus on the street, rather than chasing ghost stories and statistical errors. Then, on December 19, 1992, just 5 weeks after Claire Vance was executed in Beacon Hill, the phantom struck again. The second victim was 24-year-old Sarah Jenkins, an elementary school teacher from Brookline who had spent the evening celebrating a colleague's birthday at a restaurant in the historic Faneuil Hall Marketplace. Sarah left the venue at approximately 1:50 a.m., intending to walk 4 blocks to where her car was parked in a multi-level garage near Quincy Market. She never made it to her vehicle. At 7:15 a.m., a maintenance worker opening the parking structure found Sarah's body tucked into a narrow maintenance alcove on the 3rd floor. The physical signatures of the crime were horrifyingly identical to those found at the Claire Vance scene. Sarah had been restrained with high-grade, commercial steel handcuffs. She had not been robbed. Her gold jewelry, leather purse, and cash remained completely untouched. She had been killed by a single, contact-distance execution bullet to the base of the skull, fired from the exact same class of medium-caliber firearm. And just like the scene at Mount Vernon Street, the killer had left behind no spent brass casings, no foreign fibers, no footprints, and no struggle marks. The crime scene was a masterclass in forensic countermeasures, a pristine, terrifying execution carried out by someone who clearly understood how police crime lab technicians collected evidence and knew precisely how to eliminate every single trace of his presence. The news of a second execution-style murder shattered whatever remaining sense of security held the city together. Panic surged across Boston. College campuses implemented strict emergency curfews. Private security firms saw an unprecedented surge in requests for personal escorts, and women across the metropolitan area refused to walk the streets alone after dark. The headlines screamed from newsstands across the state, "Serial killer stalks Boston streets. The fog phantom strikes again. Women fear the night as police hunt a monster." The discovery of Sarah Jenkins' body forced the department to establish a dedicated, multi-agency task force operating out of a secure, windowless floor at BPD headquarters on Tremont Street. Over 40 detectives, state troopers, and federal agents were assigned to the case. Detective Callahan was named co-lead of the task force, but his internal suspicion remained a heavily guarded secret shared only with his partner Miller. Callahan knew that if his theory was correct, the killer was sitting in task force briefings, listening to every piece of strategy, reviewing every witness statement, and monitoring every single move the investigation made. The killer wasn't just staying one step ahead of the law, he was operating as the law itself. During the task force's processing of Sarah Jenkins' background, a critical piece of information came to light. A parking garage attendant remembered seeing a male figure wearing a long navy winter trench coat, identical to the cold weather overcoats issued to Boston police officers, standing near the stairwell entrance at approximately 2 a.m. The attendant had assumed the man was a detail officer checking the facility, a routine occurrence in downtown commercial garages. "He's using the badge as a key," Callahan whispered to Miller inside a locked interrogation room, far from prying eyes. He pulls up, identifies himself as an officer, tells these young women that there's been a rash of break-ins or a suspicious character in the area, and offers to walk them to their destination, or give them a ride. They trust him. They step into the shadow with him. And by the time they realize the cuffs aren't standard procedure, it's already over. The task force launched a sweeping, top-secret audit of all law enforcement personnel who were on duty, on off-duty security details, or unaccounted for during the time windows of both homicides. Over 600 officers across multiple precincts were quietly flagged for background reviews. But the killer was a master of administrative camouflage. He knew how to manipulate shift logs, how to swap duty assignments with unsuspecting partners, and how to utilize unmonitored spare cruisers that sat in precinct overflow lots. As 1992 turned into 1993, the trail began to grow cold, swallowed by a wall of institutional silence, technical limitations of 20th century forensics, and a terrifyingly methodical killer who refused to make a single mistake. The city of Boston held its breath every time midnight arrived, wondering when the phantom in uniform would strike again, and whether the silver badge meant to protect them was actually the shield of a cold-blooded executioner. The freezing winter of 1993 settled over Massachusetts like an iron vault, burying the city of Boston under gray, persistent ice, and a paralyzing blanket of fear. Across every neighborhood, from the historic brick rows of Back Bay to the densely populated student dormitories of Allston and Brighton, a suffocating atmosphere of dread took hold. Women walked the streets in groups of 3 or 4, clutching personal alarms and keys between their knuckles, constantly looking over their shoulders at every passing automobile. But the most terrifying aspect of the terror gripping the metropolitan area was the unspoken suspicion quietly spreading through the ranks of the task force. The monster they were hunting was sitting in their own briefings, drinking the same stale coffee, and wearing the exact same Navy uniform. By February 1993, Detective Frank Callahan and his partner Ray Miller had narrowed their focus to a terrifyingly specific operational profile. The killer was not an erratic, emotionally volatile individual acting on impulse. He was a cold, methodical technician of death. He understood the exact limitations of 1990s forensic science. He knew that latent fingerprints were difficult to lift from textured wool coats or damp leather, that forensic hair analysis was notoriously subjective, and that DNA profiling, a nascent, primitive technology in 1993, required large, pristine biological samples that were easily avoided if no sexual assault took place and no physical struggle occurred. Callahan spent sleepless nights inside the windowless task force room at BPD headquarters, surrounded by wall-sized maps, timeline charts, and mugshots. He noticed a distinct, chilling pattern in the timing of the 2 executions. Both Claire Vance and Sarah Jenkins had been targeted during the hour immediately following a major shift change, specifically the transition window between the evening watch and the late-night dog watch shift. "It's the blind spot," Callahan explained to Miller, tapping his pen against a detailed schedule of precinct patrol sectors. During shift changes, dispatchers are swapping seats, officers are turning in paperwork, cruisers are being swapped in the precinct yard, and radio chatter is at its absolute peak. If a patrol officer slips out 10 minutes early in a secondary vehicle or delays logging on to his mobile terminal, no one notices. A 5-minute gap in accountability is all he needs to pick up a target, drive her to a pre-selected kill site, and return to his sector before the roll call sergeant even finishes calling the roster. Determined to crack the wall of administrative resistance, Callahan and Miller began conducting secret, off-the-record audits of Sector A1's equipment logs. Working late into the night when the administrative offices were deserted, they manually cross-referenced gas pump receipts, odometer logbooks, and maintenance records for every spare, unassigned patrol car kept in the basement garage of the Division A station house. What they uncovered made their blood run cold. On the night of November 11th, 1992, the night Claire Vance was executed in Beacon Hill, a spare, unmarked Chevrolet Caprice police cruiser had been checked out of the motor pool at 1:15 a.m. for a routine mechanical test by a veteran sector officer. The vehicle was returned at 3 a.m. with 42 unaccounted miles logged on its mechanical odometer. No official maintenance work order had ever been filed for the car, and the signature on the physical logbook was an illegible, stylized scribble that matched no registered badge number in the precinct. Even more disturbing was what they found in the logs for December 19, 1992, the night Sarah Jenkins was murdered in the Faneuil Hall parking garage. The exact same spare Caprice had been logged out at 1:30 a.m. and returned at 2:45 a.m. Once again, 40 miles were added to the odometer, and once again, the authorization form bore the same unreadable signature. Callahan's heart pounded in his chest as he realized what he was looking at. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a ghost car, a tool used by a killer who held keys to the precinct motor pool, understood how to bypass administrative oversight, and possessed the chilling arrogance to launch murder missions directly from the basement of a police station. "We have a wolf in the fold, Ray," Callahan whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and terror. "He's using department assets to hunt young women, and someone higher up is either completely blind or actively helping him cover his tracks." Before Callahan could bring this explosive discovery to the United States Attorney's Office or the State Police Special Investigations Division, the killer struck for a third time, plunging the city into an absolute nightmare of panic and grief. On March 14, 1993, 21-year-old Laura Hastings, a gifted music student at the New England Conservatory, disappeared after leaving a late-night performance at Jordan Hall. She was last seen walking toward the Symphony MBTA station at 1:40 a.m., holding her violin case against a driving sleet storm. 7 hours later, at 8:45 a.m., a municipal worker clearing storm drains near the muddy banks of the Muddy River in the Back Bay Fens discovered Laura's body submerged beneath a thick layer of floating river ice. The physical signatures of the murder were horrifyingly consistent with the previous two victims, but with one devastating escalation. Laura had been restrained with high-grade steel handcuffs, her personal belongings and cash were untouched, and she had been executed with a single contact distance gunshot to the base of the skull. But this time, the killer had left a message, a deliberate, psychological taunt aimed directly at the law enforcement task force hunting him. Pinned to the lapel of Laura's heavy wool coat with a safety pin was a small, plastic police shield toy, a cheap, metallic-painted prize typically handed out to children during community outreach events by the Boston Police Department. The news of the third victim and the terrifying detail of the toy badge leaked to the media within hours, sending shockwaves through the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. The headline on the front page of the Boston Globe sent an icy shiver through millions of readers. "The badge killer strikes again. Music student executed in Back Bay, FENS." The public outcry exploded into full-scale political chaos. Angry mobs gathered outside BPD headquarters, demanding the immediate resignation of the police commissioner and the mayor. Local news programs broadcasted emergency town hall meetings where terrified residents screamed at panelist detectives, asking how a serial killer could move through the city completely undetected despite hundreds of extra officers patrolling the streets. Inside the task force, the atmosphere disintegrated into toxic paranoia. Detectives began eyeing each other with open hostility. Every officer's background, personal life, financial records, and duty history were subjected to aggressive, high-stakes internal audits. The FBI's behavioral science unit was brought in to construct a psychological profile of the suspect. Their conclusion confirmed Callahan's worst fears. The perpetrator was almost certainly an active or former law enforcement officer, a clinical psychopath with high intelligence, exceptional stress tolerance, a deep familiarity with police procedures, and an overwhelming need to exercise absolute control over life and death. He views himself as untouchable, the FBI lead profiler told the assembled task force inside a secure briefing room. He is using your uniform, your tactics, and your institutional blind spots to commit the ultimate crimes. He takes pleasure not just in the act of murder, but in watching you fail to catch him. Every press conference you give, every dead-end lead you chase, feeds a sense of supreme dominance. Determined to catch the killer before he could claim a fourth victim, Callahan and Miller established an undercover surveillance sting. They focused their efforts on patrol officers assigned to Sector A1 and Sector D, for who had access to motor pool keys and possessed gaps in their shift logs during all 3 murder windows. Among the officers flagged for high-priority surveillance was 34-year-old patrolman James "Jimmy" Miller, no relation to Detective Ray Miller. Jimmy Miller was a decorated 10-year veteran of the department, a former U.S. Marine Corps military policeman who had served in the Gulf War, and a charismatic, highly respected figure within his precinct. He was known as a cop's cop, first to volunteer for dangerous night shifts, highly knowledgeable about street geography, and impeccably dressed in a pristine, tailored uniform. However, beneath his charming exterior lay a series of subtle, unsettling anomalies. Jimmy Miller was single, lived alone in a secluded home in South Boston, and spent his off-duty hours obsessively studying crime scene photography and forensic textbooks. Furthermore, an internal check revealed that Patrolman Miller had been on duty near Beacon Hill on the night Claire Vance died, near Faneuil Hall on the night Sarah Jenkins was killed, and had logged off 10 minutes before Laura Hastings disappeared near the Back Bay fens. When Detective Callahan quietly reviewed Patrolman Miller's personnel file, he made a discovery that sent a jolt of adrenaline through his veins. Before joining the BPD, Jimmy Miller had served as a military police supervisor at a naval facility in Rhode Island, where he had undergone specialized training in tactical hand-to-hand combat, high-speed vehicle pursuits, and precision marksmanship using medium-caliber sidearms. On the night of April 3, 1993, Callahan and his partner set up a hidden surveillance post across from Jimmy Miller's home in South Boston. Rain was falling in heavy, relentless streams as they watched the quiet, dark street through binoculars. At 1:15 a.m., the side garage door opened, and a dark, unmarked sedan backed out into the alleyway without its headlights on. "He's moving," Callahan whispered, clicking his radio onto a secure, encrypted channel. "Target is on the move." Callahan and Miller followed the sedan at a discreet distance as it navigated the empty, rain-slicked streets of downtown Boston. The vehicle drifted slowly past closed storefronts, desolate bus stops, and dark alleyways near the Boston University campus, moving like a phantom hunter searching for vulnerable prey. Just as the unmarked sedan turned onto Commonwealth Avenue, a sudden, frantic emergency call crackled over the police radio. A major industrial fire had broken out at a warehouse near the South Boston waterfront, requiring immediate, all-units response from surrounding sectors. The street erupted in flashing emergency lights and wailing sirens. In the chaotic surge of responding emergency vehicles, the dark sedan accelerated into a narrow side street and vanished into the heavy fog. 2 days later, on April 5, 1993, Patrolman Jimmy Miller suddenly requested an abrupt, emergency leave of absence from the department, citing severe family medical issues. Within 48 hours, he packed his belongings, resigned his commission, and vanished from the state of Massachusetts, leaving behind an empty apartment, an untraceable paper trail, and a cold case investigation that was about to collapse under the weight of 3 decades of institutional silence and dead-end leads. The sudden, abrupt departure of Patrolman James "Jimmy" Miller in early April 1993 left the Boston Police Department's homicide unit reeling in a state of quiet, suffocating chaos. To the outside world, the abrupt resignation of a decorated 10-year veteran was officially described as a voluntary career change driven by personal family matters. But inside the high-security walls of BPD headquarters on Tremont Street, Detective Frank Callahan and his partner Ray Miller knew the terrifying truth. Their primary suspect, a man who possessed intimate knowledge of police tactics, forensic vulnerabilities, and city geography, had slipped through their fingers, leaving behind 3 murdered young women and a cold case file that was rapidly turning into an impenetrable wall of silence. In the weeks following Jimmy Miller's departure, Detective Callahan launched an exhaustive, off-the-record background investigation into Miller's private life. Every bank account, utility record, credit application, and personal affiliation associated with Miller was subjected to intense scrutiny. What emerged was the portrait of a master of administrative camouflage. Miller had systematically scrubbed his digital footprint, closing his local bank accounts, liquidating his pension contributions, and transferring his vehicle titles through a web of out-of-state holding addresses in New Hampshire and Vermont. He didn't panic, Callahan observed bitterly as he reviewed Miller's financial records inside a locked conference room. He knew we were watching him on the night of April 3rd. He saw our surveillance unit in South Boston, recognized our vehicle, and realized the window was closing. Instead of staying to fight an internal affairs audit, he executed a pre-planned escape strategy that he likely prepared years ago. Despite Callahan's relentless demands for a statewide, multi-agency APB, all-points bulletin, to track down the former officer, high-ranking department officials remained deeply hesitant. Without direct, irrefutable physical evidence, such as a positive fingerprint match, a recovered murder weapon, or a nuclear DNA link, issuing a public arrest warrant or murder indictment against a decorated former police officer posed a catastrophic legal and public relations nightmare for the city of Boston. The threat of a massive wrongful accusation lawsuit, combined with the devastating political fallout of admitting an active serial killer had operated from within the police department, effectively froze upper management into a state of institutional paralysis. "You bring me a shell casing, Frank," the chief of detectives told Callahan during a tense, closed-door meeting in mid-May 1993. "You bring me a fingerprint on a bullet casing, a witness who saw his face in that alleyway, or a weapon that matches the ballistics from the back of those girls' skulls. Until you have that, Jimmy Miller is a former officer who resigned honorably, and you are chasing ghosts." Frustrated, exhausted, and burdened by a deep sense of moral outrage, Callahan refused to let the investigation die. He turned his attention back to the physical evidence items recovered from the 3 crime scenes: Claire Vance's wool coat, Sarah Jenkins' leather purse, and Laura Hastings' clothing and violin case. In 1993, the State Police Crime Laboratory possessed state-of-the-art technology for its time, but that technology had severe physical limitations. Forensic DNA analysis was still in its infancy, requiring large, pristine blood or semen samples to generate a usable restriction fragment length polymorphism (RFLP) profile. Because the killer had refrained from sexual assault and had meticulously avoided leaving blood at the scenes, conventional 1990s forensic testing yielded no usable biological profiles. Callahan carefully packaged all physical evidence items from the 3 cases, placing them inside vacuum-sealed, archival storage containers filled with inert nitrogen gas. He stored them in the deepest vaults of the department's central evidence facility, attaching a bright red warning label to every container. "Permanent hold. Do not destroy. Subject to future advanced forensic analysis by order of lead Detective F. Callahan." "The science will catch up to him, Ray," Callahan told his partner as they locked the evidence locker doors in late 1993. "It might take 5 years, 10 years, or 20 years. But one day, a scientist is going to look at the microscopic dust on those clothes and find his biological signature. And when that day comes, these files will be ready." As the mid-1990s transitioned into the early 2000s, the horror of the 1992 to 1993 Boston executions slowly faded from the daily headlines of local newspapers, swallowed by the passage of time, new crime waves, and shifting public attention. The families of Claire Vance, Sarah Jenkins, and Laura Hastings were left to endure an agonizing, open-ended nightmare of unresolved grief. Yearly candlelight vigils held on the steps of the State House drew smaller crowds with each passing decade, but the lingering ghost of the badge killer remained an indelible, open wound in the collective memory of the city. In 2005, after 35 years of distinguished service, Detective Frank Callahan officially retired from the Boston Police Department. His hair had turned snowy white, and his health was declining, but his personal dedication to the unsolved murders never wavered. On his final day in office, Callahan handed his handwritten case journals, maps, and suspect dossiers to a young, rising homicide detective named Maya Lynn Vance, a sharp, fiercely dedicated investigator who represented a new generation of law enforcement professionals trained in modern forensic science. "Never close this box, Maya," Callahan said, his voice raspy as he handed her the blue case binders labeled Unsolved Homicides 92 to 1112, 92 to 1219, 93-0314. "The man who killed these women was one of ours. He wore the badge, he knew the rules, and he used our own uniform to hide his evil. Until he is wearing steel cuffs, this department's honor remains buried in that brick alley in Beacon Hill." Detective Maya Lynn Vance took the oath to heart. Throughout the late 2000s and early 2010s, as technology evolved, she periodically submitted microscopic surface swabbing requests to the state crime lab, hoping that early iterations of polymerase chain reaction, PCR, DNA testing might pull a profile from the preserved evidence. But the results were repeatedly inconclusive. The biological material transferred by simple touch in 1992 was so infinitesimally small, consisting of merely a handful of degraded skin cells, that existing laboratory sequencers could only detect faint, uninterpretable genetic noise. The breakthrough that would finally shatter 34 years of silence did not occur in a traditional police station, but inside the high-tech laboratories of the newly established National Legacy Forensic Institute in the mid-2020s. By 2025, the field of forensic science had undergone a monumental, revolutionary leap forward. The development of ultra-sensitive wet vacuum submicron touch DNA extraction, combined with high-throughput whole genome sequencing and investigative genetic genealogy, allowed forensic scientists to reconstruct complete, high-definition 600,000 SNP genetic profiles from as few as 3 or 4 dormant skin cells preserved on non-porous surfaces for decades. In early 2026, under the direction of leading genomic scientist Dr. Eris Thorne, the Institute launched a sweeping national initiative aimed at reevaluating historical cold cases involving law enforcement corruption and unidentified serial predators. Case File 92 to 1112, the 1992 execution of Claire Vance, was selected as a primary priority candidate for full Denver Protocol processing. In March 2026, Detective Maya Lynn Vance, now a veteran homicide commander, personally transported the nitrogen-sealed evidence boxes from the Boston Vault to the Institute's state-of-the-art facility. Under ultra-clean, argon gas isolation hoods, Dr. Thorne's team retrieved item E92-01A, the original steel handcuffs recovered from the scene of Claire Vance's murder in 1992. Using a specialized, multispectral optical laser density scanner paired with a liquid microvacuum extraction tool, Dr. Thorne focused his analysis not on the polished outer surface of the handcuffs, but on the microtextured internal ratchet teeth, the exact mechanical area where the perpetrator's fingers had pressed with intense physical force while locking the restraints around the victim's wrists 34 years earlier. Within 72 hours, the submicron extraction tool isolated a tiny, preserved cluster of epithelial cells trapped deep within the mechanical grooves of the steel ratchet mechanism. The biological sample was placed inside a high-throughput whole genome sequencer, decoding millions of base pairs of human DNA. On the morning of April 12, 2026, the laboratory's automated genetic processing system completed its computational analysis, generating a pristine, 100% complete nuclear DNA profile. The digital file was uploaded into the National Investigative Genetic Genealogy Database, where advanced algorithmic mapping immediately began constructing a massive, multi-generational family tree. At 3:14 a.m. on April 14, 2026, the digital interface lit up with a definitive, single-source match. The DNA profile recovered from the internal ratchet mechanism of the 1992 murder handcuffs belonged to 81-year-old former Boston Police Patrolman Jimmy Miller. The 34-year-old mystery was no longer an unsolved cold case. It was an active, high-stakes federal fugitive operation. The ghost in uniform had finally been given a name, a face, and an undeniable, unassailable scientific signature that no institutional silence could ever hide again. The electrifying confirmation generated by the quantum-assisted genetic sequencer inside the National Legacy Forensic Institute sent an immediate, high-voltage current through the upper echelons of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Boston Police Department. 34 years of institutional silence, dead-end leads, and suffocating mystery vanished in a single, definitive computational instant. The biological signature recovered from the internal steel ratchet mechanism of the 1992 handcuffs did not lie, decay, or bend to political pressure. It belonged to 81-year-old former patrolman James "Jimmy" Miller, the decorated officer who had resigned in secret in April 1993 and vanished into the vast expanse of rural America. Within 2 hours of the genetic match, an emergency joint operational command was established at BPD headquarters on Tremont Street. Detective Commander Maya Lynn Vance, flanked by assisting United States Attorney David Miller and senior FBI tactical coordinators, stood before a high-definition digital display wall displaying a comprehensive, real-time intelligence dossier on James Miller. The paper trail built by federal cyber analysts revealed that after fleeing Boston in 1993, Miller had lived a life of deliberate, hyper-disciplined anonymity. Utilizing a series of fraudulent social security numbers, secondary identities, and cash-only property arrangements, he had relocated to a remote, heavily wooded 20-acre compound near the small town of Rangeley in the western mountains of Maine. He had lived there for over 3 decades as a quiet, reclusive handyman, completely untracked by modern digital surveillance, fully convinced that the passage of 34 years had buried his crimes beneath the frozen earth of Beacon Hill. Miller built a fortress of time, Commander Lynn Vance declared during the tactical briefing, her voice cold, precise, and filled with decades of built-up resolve. He believed that because he escaped in 1993, because the original investigators couldn't overcome the limits of 20th-century forensics, that he had beaten the system. He believed that an 81-year-old man sitting in the mountains of Maine was safe from the ghosts of Claire Vance, Sarah Jenkins, and Laura Hastings. But science doesn't have a statute of limitations, and neither does this department. At 4:30 a.m. on April 18, 2026, under the cover of a dense, low-hanging mountain fog, a high-risk joint arrest operation code-named Operation Silent Badge was initiated. An elite team composed of FBI Hostage Rescue Team, HRT, operators, Massachusetts State Police tactical units, and Boston homicide detectives surrounded Miller's isolated timber compound near Rangeley. Specialized thermal drone arrays monitored the perimeter, tracking heat signatures inside the main cabin as tactical vehicles moved into blocking positions along the narrow, dirt access road. At 5:15 a.m., as the first light of dawn filtered through the tall pine trees, tactical officers deployed flashbang acoustic charges and breached the reinforced front entryway of the cabin. Federal agents, do not move. Hands where we can see them, the HRT assault leader thundered, his voice shattering 33 years of quiet isolation. Inside the dimly lit, wood-paneled living room, 81-year-old James Miller was caught completely off guard. He was sitting in an armchair beside a stone fireplace, holding a cup of hot coffee, dressed in a faded flannel shirt and work pants. Despite his advanced age, his physical frame remained broad and tall, his eyes sharp and hard with the lingering, dangerous intensity of a trained operator. He did not reach for the loaded .38 caliber revolver sitting on the side table beside him. He looked past the heavily armed tactical operators, his gaze locking directly onto Commander Maya Lynn Vance, who stepped through the shattered doorway holding an arrest warrant issued by the United States District Court in Boston. For 10 long, suffocating seconds, the cabin was dead silent, save for the crackle of tactical radios outside. Miller slowly set his coffee mug down on the table, a bitter, hollow smile touching the corners of his mouth as he let out a long, raspy breath. 34 years, Miller murmured, his voice surprisingly deep and firm despite his age. I knew the day would come when the city sent its dogs. Who gave me up? Was it someone from the precinct? Commander Lynn Vance walked up to him, stopping 2 feet from his chair. She pulled a high-resolution, full-color optical printout of the touch DNA electropherogram from her case binder and held it directly in front of his face. No one gave you up, James, Commander Lynn Vance said, her voice resonant with unshakable authority. You gave yourself up. You left 4 skin cells inside the steel ratchet mechanism of the handcuffs you locked onto Claire Vance in November 1992. You thought the metal forgot you. It didn't. Miller stared at the vivid, multicolored genetic peaks displayed on the paper, his face slowly draining of color until his skin resembled pale gray stone. The supreme arrogance that had sustained him across 3 decades of hiding collapsed in a single, devastating instant. Steel handcuffs, the exact same tool he had used to terrorize innocent young women 34 years earlier, clicked tightly around his withered wrists. The news of James Miller's arrest sent a seismic shockwave across the nation, dominating global headlines, news broadcasts, and digital media platforms. Boston 1992 cold case solved, local police officer taken into custody, the badge killer unmasked after 34 years. How advanced touch DNA demolished a cop's perfect crime. On April 20th, 2026, 81-year-old James Miller was extradited back to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts under heavy federal security. The motorcade escorting the suspect turned onto Tremont Street, passing BPD headquarters, where hundreds of citizens, media crews, and off-duty police officers stood silently along the sidewalks, watching the dark armored transport van pull into the subterranean Sally Port. Inside courtroom 4A of the Suffolk County Superior Court, sitting in the exact same courthouse where Judge Vance, Claire Vance's father, had once presided over justice, James Miller stood before a packed gallery for his formal arraignment on 3 counts of first-degree murder, federal civil rights violations, and kidnapping. Sitting in the front row of the gallery were the surviving family members of the victims, accompanied by retired detectives, community leaders, and citizens who had lived through the terrifying winter of 1992. In the center of the row sat 92-year-old retired homicide detective Frank Callahan, pushed in a wheelchair by his former partner Ray Miller. Tears of quiet, monumental validation streamed down Callahan's weathered cheeks as he watched the man who had haunted his dreams for 34 years stand before the bench in orange prison attire and heavy leg irons. As the clerk read the formal charges, District Attorney Miller stood before the court, pointing directly at the defendant. For 34 years, James Miller hid behind the sacred trust of a silver badge, the prosecutor declared, his voice echoing off the high mahogany panels of the courtroom. He used the authority granted to him by the people of Boston as a hunting license, preying upon the young, the innocent, and the vulnerable. He believed that time, distance, and institutional silence would protect him forever. But today, through the unyielding power of modern science and the tireless dedication of law enforcement, the dark curtain of history has been pulled back completely. When asked for his plea, James Miller stood silent for several seconds, looking at the photographs of Claire Vance, Sarah Jenkins, and Laura Hastings displayed on the prosecution's digital monitor. Realizing that the physical evidence against him was mathematically absolute and unassailable, Miller slowly bowed his head and spoke 3 words that officially brought an end to 34 years of terror. Guilty, Your Honor. The presiding judge sentenced James Miller to 3 consecutive life terms in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that the former officer would spend the remainder of his natural life behind the concrete walls of a maximum security state facility. That evening, as twilight fell over the city of Boston, a massive candlelight memorial was held in the brick courtyard off Mount Vernon Street in Beacon Hill, the exact site where Claire Vance had been stolen from the world in November 1992. Thousands of citizens gathered under a clear, star-filled spring sky, holding candles, laying flowers, and standing in quiet, dignified reflection. Commander Maya Lynn Vance stood beside retired Detective Frank Callahan near the memorial plaque dedicated to the 3 victims. "We did it, Frank," Maya said softly, looking down at the old detective. "We brought them home. The badge is clean again." Callahan looked at the glowing candles reflecting off the old red bricks, a peaceful, lasting smile gracing his face. "The badge was always clean, Maya," he whispered softly, his voice full of emotion. "It was the man inside it who was dark. But truth always finds a way out of the dark." The story of the 1992 Boston cold case stood no longer as a tragedy of unsolved horror, but as an eternal, triumphant monument to the power of truth, the relentless march of scientific justice, and the unyielding promise that no matter how much time passes, no matter how deep the betrayal, the light will always hunt down the shadow. The echoed gavel bang inside courtroom 4A of the Suffolk County Superior Court signaled the formal legal end of James Miller's trial, but the structural shockwaves radiating from his guilty plea tore through the historical archives of the Boston Police Department like a raging firestorm. When an 81-year-old former officer turns out to be a calculated serial killer who utilized department cruisers, precinct shift changes, and official radio blind spots to execute young women in 1992, a single question immediately haunts every homicide investigator, investigative journalist, and federal prosecutor. How many others were there? In late May 2026, 2 weeks after Miller was transported to the MCI Cedar Junction Maximum Security Facility to serve his 3 consecutive life sentences, Commander Maya Lynn Vance and Dr. Eris Thorne established an emergency task force at the National Legacy Forensic Institute, codenamed Project Sentinel. The mandate was brutal, uncompromising, and vast. Re-examine every unsolved missing person, suspicious death, and unadjudicated homicide recorded across New England between 1978 and 1993 that bore spatial, temporal, or tactical similarities to the executions of Claire Vance, Sarah Jenkins, and Laura Hastings. Inside the Institute's computational center, high-throughput servers pulled decades of digitized police logs, dispatch microfiche, and cold case files into an AI-driven spatial analysis framework. The algorithm mapped every single off-duty detail, transfer request, and sick leave record associated with James Miller during his 10-year tenure with the BPD, alongside his earlier military service record in the United States Marine Corps. Within 4 days, the digital mapping framework identified a glaring, terrifying cluster of unresolved cases in southeastern Massachusetts and Rhode Island, specifically along the Route 101 corridor near Newport and Providence, where Miller had served as a young military police supervisor between 1982 and 1985. He didn't start his hunting career in Beacon Hill in November 1992, Commander Lynn Vance stated during a closed-door briefing with the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Behavioral Analysis Unit. No serial predator begins at 33 years of age with the level of forensic sophistication, emotional detachment, and tactical perfection that Miller displayed at the Claire Vance crime scene. Beacon Hill was the refined peak of an operational methodology that he had been perfecting in the dark for over a decade. Dr. Thorne pulled up case file 83-0914 on the main glass display wall, a forgotten September 1983 cold case involving 19-year-old Ellen Lawson, a sophomore at Sal Regina University in Newport, Rhode Island. Ellen had disappeared after leaving an off-campus student gathering at midnight. Her body was recovered 3 weeks later from a marshy embankment near the perimeter fence of the former Naval Education and Training Center in Newport. The 1983 investigation had quickly stalled. The local police department lacked advanced forensic infrastructure. The crime scene had been subjected to severe coastal weather, and the victim's personal belongings had never been found. The original coroner noted wrist abrasions consistent with mechanical restraints and a fatal gunshot wound to the base of the skull, signatures that were virtually identical to the 1992 Boston homicides. For 43 years, Dr. Thorne explained, tapping the glass interface to bring up a high-definition 3D laser scan of an original physical evidence item. The only physical artifact retained from the Ellen Lawson scene was a single rusted iron staple recovered from a piece of heavy tarp found submerged in the mud 40 yards from her remains. The original 1983 state crime lab dusted it for prints, found nothing, and sealed it in a glass vial. Using the Denver Protocol, Dr. Thorne's team subjected the 43-year-old iron staple to submicron wet vacuum extraction and optical laser spectroscopy. Deep within the oxidized microcavities where the iron staple had been clamped using a heavy-duty industrial stapler, the extraction process recovered 6 dormant, ultra-low-copy human skin cells. The quantum-assisted sequencer processed the biological material overnight. At 4:12 a.m. on June 2, 2026, the system output a complete 600,000 SNP nuclear DNA profile. The match was immediate, absolute, and mathematically undeniable. 100% identity match to James "Jimmy" Miller. The discovery that Miller was an active, cross-jurisdictional serial predator nearly a decade before the Beacon Hill execution shattered the remaining historical narrative surrounding his career. Federal prosecutors, working alongside Rhode Island State Police, immediately initiated formal grand jury proceedings to indict Miller for the 1983 murder of Ellen Lawson. On June 10, 2026, Commander Maya Lynn Vance and AUSA David Miller entered the high-security visitor facility at MCI Cedar Junction to conduct a formal proffer interview with the incarcerated 81-year-old killer. Sitting behind thick bulletproof glass, wearing an orange jumpsuit and heavy steel wrist restraints, Miller looked smaller, thinner, and visibly aged, yet his eyes retained a cold, defiant glint. "We found the staple in Newport, James," Commander Lynn Vance said softly, placing the 1983 electropherogram profile against the glass window. "Ellen Lawson. September 1983. You were wearing a Navy MP uniform when you pulled her over on Ocean Drive." Miller looked at the paper for a long, silent moment. A faint, chilling smirk touched his thin lips, a brief resurfacing of the sociopathic arrogance that had driven his secret life for over 40 years. You think you're clever, because you have machines that can read rust, detective?" Miller whispered, his raspy voice scraping against the intercom microphone. "You think Newport was where it started? You don't know anything about how deep the water goes." Over the course of a harrowing 3-hour interrogation, faced with unassailable forensic proof across multiple states, Miller began to outline a horrifying timeline of unseen predation spanning from 1980 to 1993, revealing details of 5 additional unrecorded disappearances across Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire. Each confession was verified within days by task force investigators using satellite soil density radar, historical land use records, and subsurface laser mapping to recover long-buried physical artifacts. The unmasking of James Miller stood as a monumental turning point in American law enforcement history, a historic case study demonstrating how modern genomic science, cross-jurisdictional intelligence integration, and unyielding investigative determination could demolish even the most sophisticated, institutionally protected criminal enterprises. In Seattle, Claire Bennett added the final, sweeping conclusion to her landmark historical treatise on cold case forensic revolutions, The Immortal Trace. The narrative of the 1992 Boston badge killer was no longer a lingering shadow of fear. It had become the ultimate proof that truth possesses an immortal, physical weight that no badge, no passage of decades, and no wall of silence can ever erase. On a warm summer evening in July 2026, Commander Maya Lynn Vance stood on the balcony of the National Legacy Forensic Institute in Atlanta, looking out over the illuminated skyline as fresh cold case files from around the world arrived at her desk. The fight against the dark was endless, but the light was finally winning, one microscopic cell at a time. The sweeping national reverberations of James Miller's historic conviction and his subsequent confessions did not settle into a quiet lull. Instead, they catalyzed an unprecedented, high-stakes overhaul across the American criminal justice system. Across all 50 states, district attorneys, state police commanders, and chief medical examiners began pulling thousands of dusty, long-forgotten cold case files from subterranean vaults. The historic validation of the Denver Protocol, whole genome sequencing, and investigative genetic genealogy had permanently dismantled the comforting illusion of impunity once enjoyed by legacy offenders, even those who operated from behind a silver badge. But in the immediate aftermath of Miller's transfer to the maximum security facility at MCI Cedar Junction, a dark, unexpected secondary tremor began to ripple outward from the unsealed administrative archives of the Boston Police Department, a tremor that proved the badge killer was not merely a lone rogue predator, but the product of a deeply entrenched, multi-generational institutional blind spot that spanned from the early 1980s through the mid-2010s. In early October 2026, while conducting a mandatory post-conviction audit of the seized digital assets and physical evidence items associated with Case File 92 to 1112, Commander Maya Lynn Vance made a startling discovery inside a series of encrypted firewalled server partitions recovered from a private terminal previously owned by a former high-ranking BPD Internal Affairs commander, now retired in Florida. The server partitions, protected by legacy cryptographic protocols that had taken federal cyberforensic analysts 3 months to bypass, did not merely contain internal memos detailing the administrative chaos following the 1992 Beacon Hill execution. They contained a meticulously categorized, 30-year digital ledger detailing an internal network of covered-up disciplinary infractions, altered shift logs, destroyed motor pool records, and ignored citizen complaints spanning 4 decades. Miller didn't act in a total vacuum, Commander Lynn Vance stated during a high-security joint intelligence briefing inside the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Boston field office. The murder of Claire Vance in 1992 was preceded by at least 6 separate internal complaints filed against then-patrolman James Miller between 1988 and 1991. Female motorists had reported being pulled over in dark, non-residential areas by an officer in an unmarked sedan who demanded personal contact information and acted in an aggressive, threatening manner. Every single one of those reports was quietly buried, classified as unfounded, or scrubbed from the official record by a tight circle of precinct supervisors who wanted to protect the department's public reputation and shield a decorated veteran from internal scrutiny. Sitting beside Lynn Vance at the briefing table was Assistant United States Attorney David Miller, representing the Department of Justice's Special Litigation and Civil Rights Division. Spread across the conference table were color-coded organizational charts linking Miller's former supervisory chain of command to 3 separate, unadjudicated cold case disappearances. The 1986 disappearance of nursing student Rebecca Vance, no direct relation to Claire, but a key complainant in a 1985 misconduct report. The 1989 fatal hit-and-run of whistleblowing transit worker Thomas Callahan Jr. in South Boston, and the 1994 mysterious death of former precinct dispatcher Sarah Lynn Vance, a distant aunt of Commander Lynn Vance who had raised alarms over missing motor pool logbooks. For 30 years, this institutional protective shell allowed a serial predator to operate with functional immunity, AUSA Miller explained, pointing to the glowing nodes on the digital display wall. They controlled the internal affairs files. They managed the assignment rosters. They altered the mileage logs on spare patrol vehicles. They hired private investigators to intimidate civilian witnesses who threatened to go to the media. But just like Miller, they relied on 20th century assumptions. They believed that if a complaint was erased from a paper folder or a death was ruled an accidental hit-and-run in 1989, the file was closed forever. They didn't anticipate that decades later, whole genome sequencing, subsurface satellite radar, and advanced multispectral trace extraction would re-examine every single piece of preserved physical evidence in those cases. On October 18, 2026, under the authority of a federal grand jury indictment issued in the District of Massachusetts, Operation Silent Badge officially transitioned into its secondary operational phase, Phase 2, Institutional Reckoning. Armed with federal search warrants, a joint task force consisting of FBI tactical units, Massachusetts state police officers, and federal marshals executed simultaneous, synchronized raids across 6 private residences, law firm offices, and retired police association facilities in Boston, Cape Cod, and Naples, Florida. Among the primary targets was 83-year-old Arthur Vance Pemberton, a former deputy superintendent of the Boston Police Department who had overseen Sector A-1 operations in 1992, who was taken into federal custody at his oceanfront retirement home in Florida on charges of federal civil rights conspiracy, obstruction of justice, tampering with federal witnesses, and accessories after the fact in multiple homicides. The arrest of Vance Pemberton sent a secondary shockwave through New England law enforcement and political circles that eclipsed even the trial of James Miller. The man who had presided over precinct commendations, sat on state criminal justice boards, and advised municipal leaders was escorted into the federal courthouse in Boston in handcuffs, his expensive golf attire replaced by cold federal restraints. The wall of silence didn't just crack. Commander Lynn Vance told reporters outside the Moakley Federal Courthouse in South Boston as news crews scrambled for position. It dissolved completely. Arthur Vance Pemberton spent 30 years believing that protecting the image of a police department was more important than protecting human lives. Today, A federal grand jury has shown that hiding a killer inside a police station makes you an accomplice to his crimes. To build an unassailable federal prosecution case against Vance Pemberton and his surviving co-conspirators, the Joint Task Force deployed the full suite of Denver Protocol forensic technologies to the historical physical evidence items associated with the newly linked cold cases. Dr. Eris Thorne led a specialized team of forensic anthropologists and genomic experts to a remote, dense pine forest near Plymouth, a property that had been owned by a police benevolent association holding company since 1981. Utilizing satellite-based synthetic aperture radar paired with ground-penetrating laser density scanners, the team mapped anomaly patterns beneath 6 feet of sandy coastal soil. Within 72 hours of excavation, the team recovered the preserved human remains of nursing student Rebecca Vance, who had been missing since October 1986. Despite 40 years of submersion in pine forest soil, modern chemical extraction techniques applied to the interior bone marrow of the remains yielded a complete, high-definition genomic profile. Furthermore, ultrasensitive optical spectroscopy executed on a rusted leather belt buckle recovered alongside the remains isolated microscopic traces of low-copy TouchDNA. When run through the whole genome sequencing platform, the TouchDNA profile produced an exact, definitive match to both James Miller and an auxiliary biological profile belonging to former Internal Affairs investigator Richard Vance Garrison, Arthur Vance Pemberton's former chief investigator, who had signed off on scrubbing Rebecca's 1985 misconduct complaint. On November 2, 2026, federal agents arrested 76-year-old Richard Vance Garrison at his residence in Quincy, Massachusetts. The former investigator, who had spent decades enforcing internal department discipline, was led away in steel handcuffs, charged with first-degree murder and federal civil rights conspiracy in the 1986 execution of Rebecca Vance. The irony is absolute, Dr. Thorne remarked inside the State Police Trace Evidence Laboratory as he reviewed the electropherogram results from the 1986 belt buckle. Garrison spent years lecturing young officers on how latent evidence could be washed away by the elements. He fought so hard to suppress the internal complaints in 1992 because he knew, deep down in his soul, that his own skin cells were sitting in a soil sample from 1986, waiting for us to dig them up. As autumn turned to winter in late 2026, the federal civil rights and conspiracy trials associated with the BPD cover-up dominated national legal headlines. One by one, the surviving retired supervisors, dirty internal affairs investigators, and institutional enablers, exposed by the unyielding, objective language of physical science and unsealed administrative ledgers, pleaded guilty or were convicted by federal juries. Arthur Vance Pemberton, facing life imprisonment without parole on federal conspiracy charges, agreed to a comprehensive proffer agreement, revealing the full extent of the department's historical cover-ups in exchange for transfer to a federal medical facility. In Seattle, Claire Bennett watched the televised federal press conferences from her home office, tears of quiet, monumental validation streaming down her face. Her book, The Immortal Trace, had officially reached the top of the international bestseller lists, serving as the definitive historical account of how her brother Lucas Bennett's 1997 disappearance had ignited the global forensic movement that was now dismantling decades of institutional silence and corrupt empires across the nation. On a cold, clear December evening, Commander Maya Lynn Vance and Dr. Eris Thorne stood on the stone balcony of the National Legacy Forensic Institute in downtown Atlanta. Below them, the glittering city lights stretched out toward the horizon, reflecting off the glass towers of the metropolitan skyline. On the table inside sat 40 new cold case files submitted by law enforcement agencies from across the globe, files representing forgotten victims, unsolved disappearances, and historical homicides that were now receiving their second, definitive chance at justice under the Denver Protocol. When we started this journey with Claire Vance's steel handcuffs, Commander Lynn Vance said softly, looking out over the glowing city skyline, we thought we were chasing a single killer hiding behind a 34-year-old lie. We didn't realize we were picking up a thread that would pull down an entire wall of institutional corruption. Science doesn't care about the silver badge or the authority of the man wearing it, Maya. Dr. Thorne replied gently, setting down a newly processed genomic report. It only cares about the physical truth. A single cell, a single atom, a single strand of DNA carries more truth than 40 years of power, prestige, and institutional silence. Commander Lynn Vance smiled, picked up her stylus, and opened the first case file of the new batch, a 1978 unsolved case from New England. The dark shadows of the past had run out of places to hide, the old lies of absolute impunity had been permanently shattered, and the immortal beam of forensic truth continued its relentless, unstoppable march into every dark room where justice was waiting to be born. The sub-zero winds of early January 2027 howled through the narrow, snow-packed canyons of the Blue Ridge Mountains in northern Georgia, rattling the frosted double-pane windows of the high-security federal holding facility near Dahlonega. Inside the sterile, fluorescent-lit visitor consultation room, 76-year-old former police internal affairs investigator Richard Vance Garrison sat bolted to a steel chair, his orange jumpsuit hanging loosely over his visibly withered frame. Opposite him, behind a reinforced sheet of bulletproof plexiglass, sat Commander Maya Lynn Vance and Assistant United States Attorney David Miller. Spread across the stainless steel pass-through tray were high-resolution, 3D multispectral renders of a rusted 1986 leather belt buckle recovered from the Pine Barrens near Plymouth, a single piece of metal that had dismantled a 40-year wall of institutional silence. 40 years, Richard, USA Miller said, his voice flat, even, and echoing slightly off the concrete walls. 40 years since nursing student Rebecca Vance vanished off the coast of Massachusetts. You thought that because you buried her 6 feet beneath sandy coastal soil on a private parcel owned by a police association, under 4 decades of falling pine needles and seasonal snow, that the soil would digest your identity. But Dr. Thorne's team didn't just extract your nuclear DNA from that buckle. They isolated the microscopic chemical composition of the leather gloves you wore in October 1986, specifically a rare, imported treated leather compound that you purchased at a police supply store in Boston 3 days before Rebecca Vance disappeared. Garrison slowly raised his eyes, his once formidable legal and investigative mind struggling to process the terrifying, subatomic depth of modern forensic science. The man who had spent 40 years conducting internal police audits, dismissing civilian grievances, and lecturing young patrolmen on the fallibility of circumstantial evidence, looked down at his trembling, spotty hands. The illusion that a badge, institutional authority, and the sheer passage of 4 decades could insulate a killer from the physical reality of his actions was entirely gone. You don't want to die in a federal maximum security medical facility in Florence, Colorado, Richard, Commander Lynn Vance interjected, leaning closer to the speaking grate. Arthur Vance Pemberton has already signed his proffer agreement. He handed over the encrypted administrative logs, the erased dispatch records, and the names of every precinct commander who took a bribe or buried an internal complaint between 1982 and 2015. You are the last man standing on the board. If you want any chance of dying in a regional facility with decent medical care, you open the vault on the remaining cold cases right now. Garrison let out a long, raspy breath that fogged the glass in front of him. A bitter, hollow smile touched the corners of his mouth. You think you've uncovered the whole machine, don't you, Commander? He whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of exhaustion and dark, venomous spite. You think Vance Pemberton and Jimmy Miller were the only architects. Miller was an arrogant, sloppy predator who panicked in Beacon Hill because a student saw his car. Vance Pemberton was a greedy bureaucrat who liked prestige. But the network wasn't built in Sector A1. It was built in the municipal courtrooms, in the police union boardrooms, and inside the state judiciary 30 years ago. Garrison reached out with a shaky index finger, tapping the plexiglass directly over a specific entry in the unsealed 1989 administrative ledger. Look at the 1989 entries for the South Boston hit and run, Garrison murmured. Look at who signed off on the municipal transit route changes that forced Thomas Callahan Jr.'s vehicle into that deserted alleyway on the night of November 4th, 1989. Look at the judge who dismissed the federal civil rights injunctions against the department's Internal Affairs Division in 1994. You think you solved a murder case, Commander Vance. What you actually did was trigger an avalanche that is about to pull down half the establishment in the state. 2 hours later, armed with Garrison's signed federal proffer statement and a mountain of newly decrypted digital master keys, Commander Lynn Vance and AUSA Miller boarded a federal transport helicopter bound for the Atlanta headquarters of the National Legacy Forensic Institute. The winter of 2027 marked the total transformation of the Institute into the central command node for the nation's most complex cold case investigations. What had begun as a localized effort to solve the 1992 execution of Claire Vance had expanded into a massive, multi-agency operational hub where advanced genomic sequencing, artificial intelligence-driven historical spatial modeling, and optical laser spectroscopy operated in continuous, round-the-clock synchronicity. Inside the high-throughput trace evidence laboratory, Dr. Eris Thorne stood beside a team of senior genomic analysts, overseeing the processing of Batch 7, a collection of 85 legacy physical evidence items submitted by state police agencies from across Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. Suspended inside an ultra-clean, argon gas isolation chamber was a small, rusted metallic fragment recovered from the undercarriage of whistleblowing transit worker Thomas Callahan Jr.'s vehicle in 1989. For 38 years, Dr. Thorne explained as Lynn Vance walked into the lab, holding up a high-definition 3D optical render on a tablet monitor. The official 1989 investigation concluded that the impact that forced Callahan's vehicle off the road was a routine hit-and-run committed by an unidentified civilian drunk driver. The original investigators assumed it was an unfortunate accident on an unlit road. But when we applied our new subatomic thermal desorption mass spectrometry to the interior metallic residues preserved inside this impact fragment, we discovered something entirely different. Dr. Thorne tapped the display, bringing up a complex chemical spectrograph containing vivid, multicolored peaks. The paint transfer wasn't from a commercial civilian sedan, Dr. Thorne revealed, his voice filled with intense, scientific focus. It was a high-durability, lead-based dark blue enamel used exclusively on official law enforcement patrol vehicles manufactured for municipal police fleets in the late 1980s. Furthermore, using wet vacuum submicron extraction along the non-impact rubber bumper trim, we isolated a high-quality low-copy touch DNA sample. Commander Lynn Vance leaned over the display, her eyes locking onto the automated genetic match notification that had generated on the screen 20 minutes earlier. The database search had run the sample through the expanded Federal Biometric Registry, returning an immediate, high-confidence match to 78-year-old Victor Vance Garrison, a decorated former police fleet mechanics supervisor who had managed the Division A motor pool from 1985 through 2008. Garrison had lived a peaceful, prosperous retirement on a sprawling, 1,200-acre estate near Alpharetta, Georgia, fully insulated by his pension, his political connections, and the comforting belief that a 38-year-old hit-and-run in South Boston was an unshakable, forgotten memory. Victor was the syndicate's private mechanic, Commander Lynn Vance declared, her voice cold and resolute as she pulled up Victor's modern records. Whenever an auditor, a transit worker, or a whistleblowing dispatcher became a permanent threat to the internal network's expansion, Victor wiped the cruiser logs, repaired the impact damage overnight, and repainted the bumper assemblies in the basement motor pool. He prepped the vehicle in 1989, forced Callahan's car off the road, drove the damaged patrol unit back into the precinct Sallyport, and walked home an hour later, completely confident that the night had incinerated every trace of his existence. At 5:30 a.m. the following morning, January 14, 2027, under a bitter, starless winter sky, an elite tactical force comprising FBI SWAT operatives, Georgia Bureau of Investigation agents, and federal marshals executed a high-risk entry operation at Victor's estate. Breaching doors shattered the early morning quiet, and flashbang charges illuminated the snow-covered courtyard as tactical teams swept through the main residence. Victor Vance Garrison, 78 years old, but still possessing the broad frame of a former master mechanic, was caught standing in his master bedroom, reaching for a custom-built handgun hidden beneath his nightstand. Before his fingers could touch the weapon, 4 red laser target grids locked onto his chest. Federal agents. Don't move. Drop to your knees, an FBI SWAT commander thundered, his voice echoing off the vaulted timber ceilings. Victor froze, his hand hovering inches from the drawer. He looked past the tactical officers, his gaze landing directly on Commander Maya Lynn Vance, who stepped into the bedroom holding a thick, blue federal case binder labeled Case 89 to 1104, Homicide of Thomas Callahan Jr. Victor slowly lowered his hands, letting out a short, cynical laugh as he sank to his knees on the carpet. 38 years, he muttered, his voice raspy with sleep and defiance as steel handcuffs clicked around his wrists. 38 years. You people don't ever give up, do you? The rubber trim on the bumper, Victor, Commander Lynn Vance said, stepping up to him and looking down into his eyes with unyielding intensity. You left 3 skin cells on the rubber gasket while swapping the headlight assembly in 1989. You thought the body shop paint burned it all away, but rubber holds onto the truth. The arrest of Victor Vance Garrison triggered the final, catastrophic domino collapse of the internal cover-up network. Over the next 48 hours, federal prosecutors unsealed a sweeping 70-count superseding indictment charging 12 high-profile individuals, including 2 retired state court judges, a former municipal transit director, 3 prominent legal brokers, and 2 police association executives, with federal civil rights conspiracy, extortion, wire fraud, and accessories to multiple homicides. The news broadcasts across global media networks were relentless, broadcasting live updates from outside the federal court building in downtown Boston. The headlines dominated international newspapers. The fall of institutional immunity. Federal RICO indictment names judges, executives in historic police cover-up syndicate. How a 1992 touch DNA sample exposed 4 decades of departmental corruption. The Denver Protocol claims its biggest target. In Seattle, Claire Bennett sat in her study, watching a live broadcast of Commander Maya Lynn Vance addressing a national press conference in Washington, D.C. beside the Attorney General of the United States. Claire held a newly printed hardcover copy of her second book, titled The Unbroken Chain, How One Cold Case Unraveled a 40-Year Empire. The story of her brother Lucas, of Claire Vance, of Maya Lynn, and of Thomas Callahan Jr. was no longer a collection of isolated tragedies. It was the definitive historical record of a moral and scientific revolution that had fundamentally altered the landscape of human justice. On a freezing late January evening, Commander Maya Lynn Vance walked through the main rotunda of the National Legacy Forensic Institute. The grand hallway was lined with high-definition digital displays showcasing the real-time operational status of cold case investigations across 38 countries that had officially licensed the Denver Protocol. Thousands of old, unsolved homicides, cases that had sat in dark, forgotten archives for half a century, were actively being transformed into clear, unassailable scientific victories. Dr. Eris Thorne walked up beside her, handing her a freshly brewed cup of dark coffee as they looked out through the glass facade at the snow falling softly over the illuminated Atlanta skyline. We brought down the entire house, Eris, Maya said softly, watching the snow dance through the beams of the streetlights below. Every judge, every lawyer, every corrupt mechanic, and every officer who thought they could murder innocent people and buy their way out of history. We didn't bring it down, Maya, Dr. Thorne replied, his quiet voice filled with profound, lasting peace. The truth brought it down. We just gave the physical world a voice to speak it. Commander Lynn Vance smiled, took a sip of her coffee, and pulled a brand-new digital file folder from her coat pocket, a 1978 cold case disappearance from coastal New England. She opened the cover, her eyes scanning the first lines of the digitized evidence log. The dark shadows of the past had nowhere left to hide. The old lies of institutional power had been permanently shattered, and the immortal beam of forensic truth continued its relentless, unstoppable march into every dark room where justice was waiting to be born. The bitter mid-February cold of 2027 had turned the coastal salt marshes of Glynn County, Massachusetts, into an endless, frozen expanse of frosted cordgrass and iron-gray ocean tides. 50 miles south of Boston, near the historic mouth of the North River, an armada of state police amphibious transport vehicles, mobile forensic laboratory trailers, and federal law enforcement vans sat parked along a secluded, snow-dusted gravel causeway. This remote, windswept tidal peninsula, known locally as Marsh Island, had been held under private lease by a police benevolent association holding company since November 1983. For 44 years, it had remained strictly off-limits to the public, guarded by high chain-link fences, security gates, and automated surveillance posts. But on this freezing morning, guided by the unsealed, fully decrypted administrative ledgers recovered from Richard Vance Garrison's private server, the perimeter gates were cut open by federal marshals. Commander Maya Lynn Vance stood on a wooden dock overlooking the frozen marsh, her heavy winter parka zipped tightly against the biting coastal wind. Beside her, Dr. Eris Thorne adjusted the operational parameters of a newly deployed, long-range subterranean acoustic density mapper, a piece of cutting-edge geophysical hardware designed to detect microscopic anomalies in saturated soil strata without necessitating destructive excavation. According to Garrison's decrypted federal proffer, Commander Lynn Vance said, her voice crisp and clear over the hum of the portable field generators as she pulled up case file 83 to 1109. In November 1983, 31-year-old Marcus Vance, a brilliant civil engineer and half-cousin to former Deputy Superintendent Arthur Vance Pemberton, was hired to perform a comprehensive environmental assessment of this island prior to a proposed multi-million-dollar training facility development. Marcus discovered that the island sat directly atop an undisclosed toxic waste dumping zone managed by a police association holding firm. When Marcus threatened to report his findings to the Environmental Protection Agency and halt the project, he vanished. His car was found abandoned at a bus station in Providence, Rhode Island, with a staged note suggesting he had fled the country to escape personal debt. Dr. Thorne tapped the high-resolution interface on his field tablet, bringing up a real-time 3D tomographic render of the soil strata 6 feet beneath a dense grove of frozen pine trees located near the center of the peninsula. For 4 decades, Dr. Thorne explained, pointing to a distinct, dark rectangular anomaly outlined on the digital screen. The internal network operated under the belief that saturated, acidic coastal soil, combined with high salinity and freezing winters, would completely dissolve organic material and eradicate physical evidence within a few years. What they failed to understand is that wet, anaerobic saltmarsh clay actually creates a highly effective protective envelope, slowing down cellular oxidation and preserving microtrace biological signatures inside dense soil matrices. At 11:45 a.m., a specialized excavation team comprised of forensic anthropologists from the state police and federal crime scene technicians initiated a precision dig within Sector 4. Utilizing ground-penetrating radar grids and pneumatic air knives to clear away the top layers of frozen loam, the excavation team reached a depth of 5 feet. There, beneath a layer of degraded industrial plastic sheeting, they uncovered the preserved remains of Marcus Vance, accompanied by his rusted leather surveyor's transit case, his silver wristwatch frozen at 2:14, and his professional engineering seal. The crime scene was an appalling testament to cold, calculated violence. Forensic examination of the remains revealed 2 distinct gunshot entry wounds to the thoracic cavity, paired with heavy physical trauma to the facial structure. But despite the passage of 44 years in the marshland clay, Dr. Thorne's team deployed the Denver Protocol directly at the subterranean recovery site, casting a high-intensity multispectral laser grid across the preserved leather transit bag and the metallic clasps of the surveyor's tripod. Within minutes, the optical laser array detected a brilliant, fluorescent cluster of cellular deposits along the rusted steel buckle of the transit bag, the exact location where an assailant had forcibly grabbed and dragged the bag away from Marcus's body in November 1983. The soil preserved it, Dr. Thorne observed, his eyes reflecting the vivid green laser grid as he monitored the digital sensor output. The anaerobic environment prevented the breakdown of the lipophilic skin oils trapped between the steel buckle and the leather strap. We have a high-density, low-copy touch DNA profile. The recovered biological sample was processed inside the Mobile State Police cleanroom trailer parked along the causeway. Using high-throughput whole genome sequencing, the sample was decoded into a 600,000 SNP digital profile and cross-referenced against the expanded federal master database. At 4:30 p.m., the automated system generated a definitive 100% match. The DNA profile belonged to 79-year-old Victor Vance Cross, the younger brother of former Deputy Superintendent Arthur Vance Pemberton and a former senior logistics officer for the police department's Central Purchasing Division. Victor Vance Cross had lived a life of tranquil, opulent retirement in a sprawling waterfront villa in Palm Beach, Florida, completely unbothered by law enforcement for over 4 decades. He had served on corporate boards, attended philanthropic galas, and maintained a flawless public reputation as an elder statesman of local society, fully convinced that the salt marshes of Marsh Island had swallowed his crime forever. At 6 p.m., a synchronized tactical team composed of FBI SWAT operatives and Palm Beach police officers moved in on Victor Vance Cross's waterfront estate on Worth Avenue. 79-year-old Victor was sitting on his covered terrace, sipping an aperitif and reading a financial newspaper in the warm Florida evening air when tactical officers breached the perimeter gates and secured the residence. Commander Maya Lynn Vance walked onto the terrace, accompanied by federal agents holding an arrest warrant for first-degree murder and federal RICO civil rights conspiracy. As the steel handcuffs clicked firmly around Victor Vance Cross's wrists, the old man's face turned gray, his arrogant composure collapsing into a hollow, terrified stare. He looked down at his cuffed hands, then up at Commander Lynn Vance, his lips trembling violently. Marcus. Marcus was family. Victor stammered, his voice barely a whisper against the ocean breeze.
How?
How could you possibly find him after 44 years? He was family to you, Victor, Commander Lynn Vance replied, her voice cold, unyielding, and absolute. But you murdered him for a real estate contract and buried him to protect your network. And the earth held onto your skin cells until we came back for him. The arrest of Victor Vance Cross marked the 5th major cold case homicide solved under Operation Silent Badge within 18 months, further solidifying the absolute supremacy of the Denver Protocol and investigative genetic genealogy in modern law enforcement. Back in Boston, news of Victor Vance Cross's arrest sent another shockwave through legal, academic, and journalistic circles nationwide. The narrative of Claire Vance's 1992 execution had now evolved into a monumental, historic crusade that was systematically unearthing and prosecuting a half-century of hidden crimes committed by a network embedded within the highest levels of institutional power. In Seattle, Claire Bennett sat at her study, adding a new chapter to the updated edition of her best-selling book, The Immortal Trace. The crusade that had begun with her brother Lucas Bennett's cold case disappearance in 1997 had grown into an unstoppable, nationwide movement that was bringing closure to dozens of families who had spent decades living in the dark, painful shadow of unresolved grief. At the National Legacy Forensic Institute in downtown Atlanta, Commander Maya Lynn Vance stood in the Central Command Suite, looking at the large digital display wall where the organizational chart of the police cover-up network was now almost entirely illuminated in red, indicating federal convictions, guilty pleas, and life imprisonment sentences. Beside her, Dr. Eris Thorne pulled up case file 99-0412, the 1999 unsolved murder of environmental whistleblower Evelyn Vance, the final unadjudicated cold case directly linked to the internal network's historical operations. One file left on the board, Maya, Dr. Thorne said, placing the digital folder on her desk. Commander Lynn Vance picked up her stylus, opened the file, and looked at the photographs of the crime scene. Then let's finish it, Eris, she said softly. Let's turn out the last light on this empire once and for all. The icy rain of late February 2027 lashed relentlessly against the high-rise windows of the Boston Police Department's Central Command Suite, turning the glowing neon lights of downtown into blurred, crimson streaks against the pitch-black sky. Inside the suite, the air was still, heavy with the quiet, formidable focus of a veteran team approaching the final summit of a long, arduous trek. Mounted on the main digital wall was case file 99-0412, the April 1999 cold case, murder of 26-year-old environmental activist Evelyn Vance. She was the final unadjudicated victim directly tied to the historical cover-up operations of the internal police network. Her case file had sat cold, frozen, and untouched for 28 years in the subterranean vaults of the Suffolk County Courthouse, labeled as a tragic, random home invasion gone wrong. Commander Maya Linvance stood at the glass marker board, writing down the refined timeline of April 14, 1999. Beside her, Dr. Eris Thorne adjusted the multispectral laser optics on the laboratory workbench, where item E99-08, a preserved copper padlock recovered from the back door of Evelyn's historic brick row house in South Boston, sat resting on a velvet tray under an inert argon hood. In 1999, the original precinct investigators were led to believe that Evelyn's murder was the opportunistic act of a neighborhood burglar, Commander Linvance said, her voice resonant with a quiet, unshakable intensity as she turned to face AUSA David Miller and the senior homicide team. Her house was ransacked, her laptop was missing, and the rear kitchen door frame was splintered. But when you re-examine the physical evidence through the lens of what we now know about the syndicate's operational patterns, the true picture becomes terrifyingly clear. Evelyn wasn't killed by a burglar. She was targeted because 48 hours prior to her death, she had filed a formal federal petition under the Clean Water Act, documenting illegal toxic sludge disposal on industrial waterfront properties managed by holding companies tied to former Deputy Superintendent Arthur Vance Pemberton. Dr. Thorne stepped up to the digital display, bringing up a 3D optical surface reconstruction of the copper padlock. When the killer bypassed the rear entry of Evelyn's home, he utilized a specialized pair of heavy-duty hydraulic bolt cutters to snap the shackle of this copper padlock, Dr. Thorne explained, pointing a digital light marker at the microscopic grooves along the severed metal edge. The 1999 crime lab dusted the exterior copper casing for latent fingerprints using traditional black powder, returning smudged, unclassifiable results. But using our low-copy touch DNA protocol paired with multispectral optical laser spectroscopy, we didn't focus on the smooth outer casing. We focused on the micro-textured internal locking jaw mechanism, where the tool's mechanical shear force drove microscopic cellular debris from the operator's hands deep into the serrated metal teeth of the lock. Using the wet vacuum submicron extraction system, Dr. Thorne's team pulled the dormant biological material from the copper lock's internal mechanism. The recovered sample was processed through the high-throughput whole genome sequencer, decoding over 600,000 single nucleotide polymorphisms across the human genome. Within 48 hours, the digital profile was uploaded into the National Investigative Genetic Genealogy Database. The computational match notification generated at 3:15 a.m. on March 2, 2027. The algorithm returned a direct, high-confidence nuclear DNA match. The biological signature on the copper padlock belonged to 74-year-old former state senator and retired corporate attorney Harrison Vance Cross, the maternal cousin of Arthur Vance Pemberton and a prominent member of the State Ethics Commission in 1999. Vance Cross had lived a life of towering political influence, sitting on legislative committees, shaping state environmental laws, and enjoying an unblemished public reputation as a distinguished elder statesman of legal governance. He lived in a grand, oak-shaded estate in the historic district of Brookline, Massachusetts, completely convinced that 28 years of political power had rendered his secret forever untouchable. Harrison Vance Cross was the legal architect of the cover-up network, Commander Linvance declared during an emergency briefing with state and federal tactical commanders. He didn't just write the fraudulent property deeds and manage the offshore tax shelters. When Evelyn Vance threatened to expose their environmental crimes and police payoffs to federal prosecutors in 1999, Vance Cross drove to her home, snapped her lock, staged a burglary, and executed her in her own kitchen. He believed that his position as a state senator and his family's deep ties to the department would shield him from suspicion forever. At 6:30 a.m. on March 4, 2027, an elite joint tactical unit consisting of FBI SWAT, Massachusetts State Police officers, and BPD homicide detectives surrounded Vance Cross's sprawling historic estate in Brookline. As cold morning fog hung thick over the manicured gardens, tactical teams breached the iron gates and secured the residence. Harrison Vance Cross was sitting in his wood-paneled library, dressed in a silk robe, sipping tea and reading a legal journal when Commander Maya Lynn Vance pushed open the heavy oak doors, backed by armed federal agents. Vance Cross looked up, his sharp, aristocratic eyes taking in the tactical gear, the gold police badges, and the thick federal case binder in Lynn Vance's hand. He didn't drop his teacup. He simply set it down slowly on his mahogany desk, his face draining of color until his skin resembled pale parchment. "Harrison Vance Cross," Commander Lynn Vance said, her voice cold, precise, and absolute. "You are under arrest for the April 1999 first-degree murder of Evelyn Vance, federal civil rights RICO conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. Your DNA was recovered from the internal locking jaws of the padlock you cut at her house 28 years ago." For 10 long seconds, the library was dead silent, save for the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Vance Cross looked down at his hands, then up at Lynn Vance, a bitter, hollow smile touching his lips as the grand illusion of his life dissolved into nothingness. "The padlock," Vance Cross whispered, his raspy voice trembling with the realization that the physical universe had held his signature for nearly 3 decades. "You pulled a profile from inside the cut metal." "The metal didn't forget you, Harrison," Lynn Vance replied softly as heavy steel handcuffs clicked tightly around his wrists. "And neither did Evelyn." The arrest of Harrison Vance Cross was the final, decisive blow that brought about the complete, total annihilation of the corrupt internal network. Over the next 2 weeks, federal grand juries unsealed the final superseding indictments, securing guilty pleas and life imprisonment sentences for every surviving member, associate, and corporate enabler of the multi-generational syndicate. On March 20, 2027, a historic ceremony was held inside the rotunda of the Massachusetts State House in Boston to mark the formal conclusion of Operation Silent Badge. The governor, the Attorney General of the United States, federal judges, law enforcement leaders, and cold case advocates gathered to honor the investigative team that had transformed modern criminal justice. Hanging above the grand marble staircase was a newly dedicated bronze memorial plaque bearing the names of the primary victims whose tragedies had sparked a global forensic revolution: Claire Vance, Lucas Bennett, Sarah Jenkins, Laura Hastings, Marcus Vance, Thomas Callahan Jr., and Evelyn Vance. Commander Maya Lynn Vance stood at the podium before a vast assembly of journalists, international law enforcement delegates, and victims' families. Beside her stood Dr. Eris Thorne and Claire Bennett. Sitting in the front row, holding his partner Ray Miller's arm, was 92-year-old retired Detective Frank Callahan, smiling through tears of monumental peace. For over 30 years, Commander Lynn Vance said into the array of microphones, her voice echoing off the high gilded dome of the State House, the story of the cold case was a story of silence, of unresolved grief, and of perpetrators who believed that time and authority were their ultimate accomplices. Today, we stand here to declare that the age of impunity is over. What began 34 years ago in a dark brick alley in Beacon Hill has grown into an unstoppable, immortal light that is sweeping across the nation. To every victim's family still waiting in the dark, we see you, we hear you, and we are coming for the truth. Following the ceremony, Claire Bennett walked out onto the granite plaza, holding a copy of her finalized, multi-volume history of the forensic movement. She looked up at the clear, crisp spring sky, feeling the warm sunshine on her face, a warmth that felt like a quiet, eternal blessing from her brother Lucas and all those who had finally been brought home into the light. Back at the National Legacy Forensic Institute, Commander Maya Lynn Vance walked through the quiet, glass-walled corridors of the Trace Evidence Division. On the primary digital status board, the organizational chart of the internal police cover-up syndicate was completely illuminated in solid, glowing green, every entry stamped with the word adjudicated. She entered her office, walked over to her desk, and picked up a brand new stack of incoming cold case files submitted by law enforcement agencies from across the globe, files from London, Sydney, Tokyo, and Toronto, all seeking deployment of the Denver Protocol. Dr. Eris Thorne walked into the doorway, leaning against the frame with a warm, quiet smile. "Ready for the next chapter, Maya?" he asked. Commander Maya Lynn Vance looked down at the new files, then back up at Dr. Thorne, her eyes shining with unshakable resolve and purpose. "The past doesn't sleep anymore, Eris," she said softly, opening the first folder. "And neither do we." The digital status board inside the main war room of the National Legacy Forensic Institute glowed with a tranquil, steady green. Across 11 parts, 7 major investigations, and 4 decades of systemic deception, every node on the original organizational chart of the Boston Police Network had been marked as adjudicated. James Miller was serving consecutive life sentences in maximum security. Arthur Vance Pemberton, Richard Vance Garrison, Victor Vance Garrison, Victor Vance Cross, and Harrison Vance Cross were all in federal custody or facing permanent imprisonment, and the historical homicides of Claire Vance, Sarah Jenkins, Laura Hastings, Ellen Lawson, Rebecca Vance, Marcus Vance, Thomas Callahan Jr., and Evelyn Vance had been definitively resolved. Yet, inside the quiet, climate-controlled laboratory space where Dr. Eris Thorne and Commander Maya Lynn Vance worked, a new phase was quietly taking shape, not as a continuation of local corruption, but as the inauguration of an international forensic doctrine. It was early spring in 2027. The success of Operation Silent Badge and the complete validation of the Denver Protocol had transformed the Institute from a specialized regional project into the global apex center for cold case adjudication. Delegations from Scotland Yard, the Australian Federal Police, Interpol, and the Japanese National Police Agency flooded into the Atlanta facility, eager to integrate quantum-assisted genomic sequencing, multispectral laser spectroscopy, and submicron wet vacuum trace extraction into their own national investigative architectures. Standing before an assembly of international homicide directors inside the Institute's main auditorium, Commander Maya Lynn Vance gestured to a high-definition digital map of the world. Glowing points of light peppered every continent, each point representing an active cold case file submitted by foreign jurisdictions seeking to apply the methodology that had dismantled the badge killer network. For nearly a century, Commander Lynn Vance addressed the International Assembly, her voice calm, authoritative, and resonant. Law enforcement agencies around the globe treated time as the ultimate adversary. We accepted the tragic notion that if a crime went unsolved for 10, 20, or 30 years, physical evidence deteriorated, witnesses faded, and justice naturally expired. What we proved in Boston, in Maine, and across New England was that time is not an adversary to science. It is merely a quiet vault. The physical world retains every touch, every strand of cellular material, every atomic alteration. Our duty is no longer limited to investigating the present. Our duty is to systematically audit the past. Beside her, Dr. Eris Thorne brought up the operational interface for Project Global Legacy, the expanded international database designed to process high-throughput whole genome sequencing profiles from legacy cold cases spanning 50 years. The methodology we refined during the Claire Vance investigation, Dr. Thorne explained, tapping the glass interface to demonstrate the submicron extraction modeling, is no longer bound by geography or jurisdiction. Whether a sample was recovered from a steel handcuff in 1992, a rusted padlock in 1999, or a buried canvas bag in 1983, the fundamental physics remain identical. Subatomic thermal desorption mass spectrometry and optical laser grids can isolate low-copy touch DNA even when a surface has been exposed to extreme weather, chemical degradation, or decades of physical storage. Among the primary international initiatives launched during the symposium was Operation Northern Light, a joint operational agreement between the United States Department of Justice and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP. The initiative aimed to apply the Denver Protocol to a series of 32 unadjudicated disappearances and homicides along Canada's Highway 16, spanning from the mid-1970s through the late 1990s. On the first afternoon of the joint operation, Commander Lynn Vance and Dr. Thorne met with senior RCMP investigator Karen Reed in the Institute's high-throughput cleanroom suite. Spread across a sterile examination bench were preserved physical evidence, containers shipped under diplomatic seal from Ottawa, containing historical physical artifacts from a cold case dating back to October 1979. Case 79 to 8801, Inspector Reed said, opening the archival folder. 18-year-old Joanne Mercer disappeared while traveling near Prince George, British Columbia, in October 1979. Her remains were discovered 2 years later in a remote logging area. The original case file noted mechanical wire restraints used on her wrists, but no usable fingerprints or biological evidence could be recovered with 1980s technology. For 48 years, her family has lived without a single answer. Dr. Thorne carefully lifted a small, oxidized section of coated copper wire from the evidence container, placing it beneath the argon gas isolation hood of the wet vacuum extraction apparatus. The wire coating is porous polyvinyl chloride, Dr. Thorne noted, focusing the multispectral laser grid across the surface. Over 48 years, moisture and soil pressure compressed the outer layer, but the microscopic crevices along the twist junctions preserve the lipophilic skin oils trapped during the binding process. As the multispectral laser illuminated the wire fragment, a brilliant green fluorescent pattern emerged across the monitor, a dense, highly localized cluster of dormant human skin cells preserved inside the microcavities of the copper twist. The extraction process took less than 40 minutes. The wet vacuum system pulled the cellular material, which was immediately transferred to the quantum-assisted genomic sequencer. The automated computational system processed 600,000 single nucleotide polymorphisms, constructing a high-resolution 3D nuclear DNA profile. At 8:14 p.m., the system output a definitive international database match. The profile matched an 84-year-old retired long-haul truck driver currently living in an assisted care facility in Calgary, Alberta, whose genetic profile had been uploaded to a public genealogy platform by his distant relatives 3 months prior. Inspector Reed stared at the screen, tears welling in her eyes as 4 decades of painful obscurity dissolved into a single, undeniable scientific fact. 48 years, she whispered softly. Her mother passed away 5 years ago, still waiting for this call. But her sister is still alive. I can finally tell her we found him. That is why we built this institute, Karen, Commander Lynn Vance said, placing a supportive hand on the Canadian officer's shoulder. Science doesn't forget, and neither do we. The resolution of the 1979 Canadian cold case, within 48 hours of receiving the evidence, served as the ultimate proof that the revolution begun in Boston had become a permanent, global reality. The Denver Protocol was officially adopted as the gold standard for cold case adjudication by Interpol, launching synchronized legacy audits across 24 participating nations. In Seattle, Claire Bennett put the finishing touches on the final, definitive edition of The Immortal Trace. Her book was no longer just an investigative narrative. It had been adopted as mandatory curriculum in forensic science, criminology, and law programs at over 200 universities worldwide. In her closing chapter, she reflected on the long, transformative journey that had begun with her brother Lucas Bennett's disappearance and culminating in the dismantling of the Boston Network and the birth of a global forensic movement. Justice was once thought to be a fragile, fleeting thing, Claire wrote in her concluding paragraph. We believed that if the truth was not caught in the immediate light of day, it would be swallowed by the dark of passing years. But we have learned that the physical world is an unyielding witness. A single cell, a microscopic strand of DNA, a microtextured scratch on metal, these are immortal signatures of truth. No badge can hide a lie, no authority can silence the soil, and no passage of time can extinguish the light once science learns how to see it. On a clear, serene evening in May 2027, Commander Maya Lynn Vance stood on the elevated terrace of the National Legacy Forensic Institute in Atlanta, looking out over the city skyline as twilight gave way to a vast, star-filled sky. Behind her, inside the glass-walled war room, Dr. Eris Thorne and a team of young, brilliant forensic scientists were already setting up Batch 12, processing legacy physical evidence items from historical cases submitted by law enforcement agencies in London, Sydney, Paris, and Tokyo. Retired Detective Frank Callahan, now 93, had sent a small framed photograph earlier that week, a picture of himself and his partner Ray Miller standing in front of the newly dedicated memorial plaque at BPD headquarters on Tremont Street. On the back of the frame, Callahan had written a simple, handwritten note. "The badge is clean, Maya. Thank you for bringing us home." Dr. Thorne walked out onto the terrace, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. He handed one to Maya, standing beside her as the cool night breeze rustled through the trees below. "Interpol just submitted 30 new case files from Western Europe," Dr. Thorne said softly, a warm, quiet smile playing on his lips. "Cases dating back to 1972. They're asking for the Denver Protocol on all of them." Commander Lynn Vance took a sip of her coffee, looking out toward the endless horizon where light met the dark. "Then let's get back to work, Eris," Maya said, her voice filled with deep, enduring peace and unwavering resolve. "The past is waiting, and we have a lot of work to do." The late summer heat of August 2027 hung heavy over the glass and steel expanse of the Interpol General Secretariat in Lyon, France. Inside the underground auditorium of the European Cybercrime and Forensic Command, the air was cool, quiet, and dense with international expectation. Sitting in rows of polished mahogany desks were delegates representing law enforcement agencies from 46 nations, ranging from the Metropolitan Police Service of London to the Federal Criminal Police Office of Germany, the National Police Agency of Japan, and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Mounted on the central high-definition display wall was a massive, interactive global map labeled Operation Immortal Trace, Phase I. Across the continent of Europe, dozens of glowing amber nodes marked legacy cold cases spanning from 1968 to 2005, unsolved homicides, mysterious disappearances, and high-profile political assassinations that had defied classical investigative techniques for over half a century. Commander Maya Lynn Vance stood at the central lectern, her sharp, tailored charcoal suit reflecting the dim light of the projection screens. Beside her at the technical console sat Dr. Eris Thorne, monitoring a live, secure data pipeline connecting the Lyon Command Hub directly to the supercomputing cluster at the National Legacy Forensic Institute in Atlanta. For generations, Commander Lynn Vance began, her voice carrying across the silent hall with absolute clarity and authority. The global law enforcement community operated under a fundamental misconception regarding time. We treated time as a destructive force that slowly eroded evidence, erased memories, and shielded the guilty. But as we demonstrated throughout the dismantling of the Boston network, time is not an eraser. It is a vault. Organic compounds do not simply vanish. They degrade into predictable, subatomic daughter elements. Metal surfaces do not forget pressure. They retain crystalline deformations at the molecular level. Today, through the international deployment of the Denver Protocol, we are officially opening that vault on a global scale. Dr. Thorne tapped a command into his tablet, bringing up the technical specifications of Project Epilogue, a specialized international subroutine designed to process ultra-low-copy touch DNA samples recovered from historical crime scene items that had been stored under non-ideal archival conditions across Europe during the Cold War era. The primary challenge with legacy European evidence, Dr. Thorne explained to the assembly, pointing to a multispectral optical scan of a weathered leather strap, lies in the sheer variety of storage protocols used throughout the late 20th century. Samples were exposed to formaldehyde vapors, improper humidity levels, and primitive chemical dusting agents. Standard short tandem repeat, or STR, profiling fails completely on such heavily degraded biological material because the DNA strands are fragmented into segments shorter than 50 base pairs. However, our quantum-assisted whole genome platform does not require long intact strands. By sequencing over 600,000 single nucleotide polymorphisms simultaneously, we can construct a complete, high-definition genomic profile from fragments as short as 15 base pairs. The first priority case selected for live international adjudication under Operation Immortal Trace was Case File 74-0911. The infamous September 1974 unsolved murder of 22-year-old university student Brigitte Laurent in the Black Forest region near Freiburg, West Germany. Brigitte had vanished while cycling home from the university library. Her body was discovered 3 weeks later in a secluded woodland ravine, bound with industrial cotton cord and bearing injuries consistent with a methodical, highly disciplined predator. For 53 years, The Baden-Württemberg State Police had preserved the original evidence items in a climate-controlled vault in Stuttgart: the victim's faded leather satchel, her rusted bicycle frame, and 3 fragments of the yellow industrial cotton cord used to bind her wrists. Over 5 decades, German criminalists had subjected the cord to every emerging forensic methodology: chemical chromatography in the 1980s, early PCR amplification in the late 1990s, and mitochondrial DNA testing in 2012, all returning inconclusive, heavily contaminated results. At 10:15 a.m., under the direct supervision of Chief Inspector Karl Weber of the Bundeskriminalamt, a sealed, temperature-regulated transport case containing a 2-inch segment of the 1974 cotton cord was brought into the cleanroom suite adjacent to the Lion Auditorium. Dr. Thorne, dressed in a full-body anti-contamination suit, carefully placed the 53-year-old cotton fibers inside the argon gas isolation chamber of the submicron wet vacuum extraction unit. High-intensity multispectral laser optics swept across the weave of the cord, mapping the topographical microcavities where the cotton fibers intersected. "Notice the interior weave," Dr. Thorne pointed out on the large audience display screen. When an assailant ties a high-friction knot, the mechanical force compresses the outer epidermal cells of their hands, forcing microscopic lipid droplets and skin fragments deep into the inner core of the cotton fibers. While the outer surface of the cord was contaminated by handling over 5 decades, the internal core remained sealed in an anaerobic microenvironment. The wet vacuum system deployed an ultra-fine aerosolized buffer solution at high pressure, dislodging the trapped microscopic cellular debris from the core of the knot without damaging the historical textile. The extracted liquid was immediately drawn into the microfluidic channel of the inline genomic sequencer. Across the auditorium, 200 international delegates held their breath as the digital progress bar on the main display wall moved steadily from data acquisition to alignment, variant calling, and genealogical cross-referencing. The computational cluster in Atlanta executed billions of matrix calculations per second, comparing the recovered SNP profile against millions of records across global public genetic registries, historical census databases, and military service archives. At 11:42 a.m., a sharp chime echoed through the auditorium speakers. The display flashed bright green, generating a definitive computational match notification. Interpol Global Legacy Forensic System. Match confirmed. Case file 74-0911, Freiburg, Germany, 19